At my own daughter's wedding, her groom toasted me, calling me a worthless liar in front of 160 guests. I said nothing. I just calmly walked to the stage and opened my briefcase. He started screaming. My name is Howard. I am 69 years old. As an African-American man who spent decades running an auto mechanic shop, I am entirely used to being underestimated by arrogant men. Before I continue this story of absolute ruin, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely miscalculated your worth. The wedding reception finally reached its absolute peak. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over the wide tables. Bradley loudly commanded the center stage. He held a microphone in his left hand and a glass of imported champagne in his right. He was surrounded by his elite tech investors, men in tailored tuxedos who viewed the world entirely through profit margins. I sat at a small, dimly lit table near the swinging kitchen doors. They deliberately placed me away from the main action, hiding me like an embarrassing secret. I wore my best suit, a suit I purchased over 2 decades ago. The fabric was slightly faded, but it was impeccably clean and perfectly pressed. I sat with my hands folded, watching the entire spectacle. Bradley tapped a silver spoon against his champagne glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the loud chatter. The room immediately fell silent. Everyone turned their attention to the stage. Bradley wrapped his arm tightly around my daughter Naomi. She looked stunning in her white gown, but her smile was strained and anxious. She kept glancing toward my table with an expression of deep discomfort. Bradley pointed his glass directly at me. He grinned broadly, but his eyes were completely cold and devoid of any genuine joy. He cleared his throat and spoke directly into the microphone. He announced to the crowd that he wanted to make a very special toast to his new father-in-law. A few people clapped politely. Then Bradley laughed. It was a cruel, echoing sound. He declared to the entire room of wealthy guests that he had to finance this event entirely out of his own pocket. He called me a broke freeloader who could not afford to pay for a single floral arrangement. He told his elite friends that I was a living ghetto stereotype, a dirty grease monkey who lived in the past and expected endless handouts from his brilliant, highly successful son-in-law. He mocked my suit, my rusty pickup truck, and my entire existence. The room fell completely silent. The clinking of expensive silverware stopped instantly. 160 guests turned to stare at me with a sickening mixture of pity and utter disdain. Naomi gasped in absolute horror. She ripped her arm away from Bradley and covered her mouth with both trembling hands. She whispered my name, but the sound was lost in the vast, quiet ballroom. I did not shout. I did not throw my drink. I did not act defensive. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The scraping of the wooden chair legs against the floor sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I reached down and picked up my heavy, worn leather briefcase from the floor. I gripped the handle firmly. I walked steadily across the polished hardwood floor, moving directly toward the brightly lit stage. The walk felt incredibly long. Every eye in the room tracked my movement. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others smirked, expecting a public meltdown from a defeated old man. They did not know that my heart beat with a slow, mechanical, and highly calculated rhythm. Every single step I took carried exactly 30 years of silent, ruthless preparation. After my wife Evelyn passed away 30 years ago, I realized that survival required absolute financial power. I took every single penny of profit from my mechanic shop and aggressively funneled it into commercial real estate. I purchased failing strip malls, renovated them, and flipped them into massive corporate centers. I built a billion-dollar holding firm in total secrecy. I intentionally kept my rusty tools, my old pickup truck, and my faded suits. Wealth that loudly announces itself is wealth that easily gets stolen. True power operates entirely in the shadows. Bradley thought I was a relic of the past. He believed he was dealing with a mechanic. He had absolutely no idea he was dealing with the invisible landlord who owned half the commercial properties in the city. I stepped up the short stairs and walked onto the stage. Bradley smirked confidently. He lowered the microphone to his side, clearly expecting me to offer a pathetic, slurring apology or perhaps beg for his forgiveness in front of his wealthy peers. He puffed out his chest, asserting his physical dominance. I bypassed him completely. I walked straight to the wooden podium and placed my heavy leather briefcase on top of it. I pressed my thumbs against the brass locks. They snapped open with a sharp, satisfying click. I reached inside the dark leather interior and pulled out a single, neatly folded document. It was printed on heavy, premium paper and bore a prominent red federal seal at the bottom. I turned around and walked back to Bradley. I handed the document directly to him without uttering a single syllable. Bradley snatched the paper from my hand. His arrogant grin remained fully intact. He clearly assumed I was handing him a meaningless card or a desperate plea for financial assistance. He flicked his wrist and unfolded the document. His eyes scanned the first line of the bold text. The change was instantaneous and violent. The crystal champagne glass slipped entirely from his trembling fingers. It struck the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. The champagne splashed across his expensive leather shoes. Bradley let out a visceral, high-pitched scream of pure, unadulterated panic. The sound ripped through the silent ballroom, causing several guests to jump from their seats in alarm. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale shade of ash. His knees buckled slightly as if an invisible weight had just crushed his spine. He gripped the document with both his hands, shaking uncontrollably as the reality of his situation set in. The paper in his hands was an immediate federal foreclosure notice. It detailed the total liquidation of his entire startup company, the seizure of his corporate assets, and the immediate freezing of his operational capital. It was signed and legally executed by the anonymous corporate holding firm that Bradley owed exactly $40 million to. He had leveraged his entire fake life on a massive commercial loan from an unseen corporate entity. He slowly looked up from the paper and stared directly into my eyes. I stared back with absolute zero empathy, watching him crumble. I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of that exact holding firm, and his career is officially over. Exactly 6 months before the champagne glass shattered on the ballroom floor, the foundation of Bradley's absolute destruction was laid in my own kitchen. It was a Tuesday morning. I was standing at the worn Formica counter of my suburban home, a house I had purposely kept unchanged since my wife Evelyn passed away 3 decades ago. The scent of cheap, dark roast coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint, permanent smell of motor oil that I always made sure lingered on my clothes. I was carefully wiping down a carburetor valve when the aggressive crunch of tires on my gravel driveway broke the quiet. I did not need to look out the window to know who it was. The obnoxious roar of a high-performance engine belonged exclusively to Bradley. He drove a leased luxury sports car, a vehicle he could not actually afford, strictly to project an image of relentless success to his Silicon Valley investors. The front door swung open without a knock. Bradley strode into my kitchen, bringing with him the frantic, nervous energy of a man secretly drowning in debt. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than most men made in a month, yet he looked entirely unkempt. He was sweating heavily despite the cool morning air, his eyes darting around the room with manic impatience. I picked up a ceramic mug, poured a fresh cup of black coffee, and slid it across the counter toward him. I offered him a calm, polite morning greeting, maintaining the exact persona he expected of me. Bradley did not even look at the mug. He shoved it away with the back of his hand, spilling a few drops of hot, dark liquid onto the clean counter. He paced the length of my small kitchen, looking at the faded floral wallpaper and the old linoleum floor with naked, unrestrained disgust. He treated my home not as a place of memory and hard work, but as a pitiful shack occupied by an obsolete old man who had failed at life. Bradley stopped pacing abruptly and reached into the inner breast pocket of his designer jacket. He pulled out a glossy, heavy-stock trifold brochure and slapped it violently onto the counter between us. The paper landed with a sharp smack that echoed in the quiet room. I looked down. The cover featured a highly staged stock photo of elderly people smiling on a cheap plastic park bench. The bold letters across the top read, "Shady Pines Assisted Living." It was a low-income, state-run senior facility notorious in our county for its abysmal conditions and neglect. Bradley leaned his knuckles heavily on the counter and began his pitch. He did not ask for my opinion, nor did he frame his words as a suggestion. He issued a cold, hard directive. He told me it was time to face reality. He claimed I was getting too frail to maintain a house of this size, and that living alone in a working-class neighborhood was a severe hazard to my health. Then he quickly pivoted to his true, desperate motive. He demanded that I put my house on the market by the end of the week. He aggressively calculated the equity I had supposedly built up over 40 years of working as an auto mechanic and demanded I liquidate the property immediately. He wanted me to take the cash from the sale of my only home and hand it directly over to Naomi. He framed this financial extortion as a fatherly duty. He told me Naomi desperately needed the capital to help fund his new tech startup. He painted a grand, delusional picture of an upcoming software launch that would completely revolutionize his industry, promising that my personal sacrifice would guarantee Naomi a life of unimaginable luxury. He spoke rapidly, using hollow corporate buzzwords and aggressive sales tactics, completely ignoring the fact that he was demanding a grown man make himself homeless to fund a speculative venture. I kept my hands resting flat on the counter. I looked down at the insulting brochure, then looked directly into Bradley's manic, dilated eyes. I told him with absolute and terrifying calm that this house was paid for with 30 years of calloused hands and aching joints. I told him I built this specific life with Evelyn and I had absolutely no intention of selling my memories to fund his volatile business ventures. I flatly rejected his demand without raising my voice a single decibel. My calm refusal hit him like a physical blow. The fake salesman's smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a vicious, unrestrained sneer. Bradley closed the distance between us, stepping aggressively into my personal space. He loomed over me, trying to use his height and his expensive suit to intimidate a man he believed was nothing more than a fragile, broke mechanic. His breath smelled intensely of stale alcohol, expensive mints, and deep financial panic. He dropped his voice into a low, mocking whisper. He told me my stubborn ghetto pride was completely pathetic and holding my daughter back from a real future. He laughed, a cruel scraping sound that filled the quiet kitchen. He said I was entirely foolish to think my permission mattered in the slightest regarding their finances. Bradley boasted that he did not actually need the cash from my pathetic little house anyway. He revealed that he had already convinced Naomi to blindly co-sign a massive commercial loan for his company. He smiled with pure malice, informing me that Naomi had legally tied her entire financial future to his corporate debt. He gloated that they were moving forward with the wedding and the aggressive business expansion, rendering me completely powerless to stop them. He told me to enjoy rotting in my rusty house while they built an empire. I did not react. I did not yell, curse, or raise a hand to strike him, even though my blood ran absolutely cold at the specific mention of Naomi co-signing a commercial loan. I simply stood my ground in total silence. My lack of emotional response frustrated him deeply. He wanted a screaming match. He wanted to feel superior to an angry, helpless old man. Instead, he met a wall of absolute, impenetrable stillness. Furious by my silence, Bradley snatched the senior living brochure off the counter, crumpled it into a tight ball, and threw it forcefully into my kitchen trash can. He turned on his heel, kicked the screen door open, and marched out to his leased car. I stood by the window and watched him rev the engine aggressively before speeding backward down the driveway, kicking up a thick cloud of dust and gravel into the street. I waited exactly 60 seconds to ensure his car had completely turned out of the neighborhood. The moment the sound of his engine faded into the distance, the facade of the slow, retired auto mechanic dropped entirely. My posture straightened. I walked purposefully to the trash can. I did not reach for the crumpled brochure he had just thrown away in his temper tantrum. I reached deep into the bin for what he had carelessly thrown away before I entered the kitchen. It was a piece of heavy bank stationery folded haphazardly and stained with a dark coffee ring. Bradley must have pulled it from his pocket and tossed it while he was nervously waiting for me to walk into the room. I pulled the heavy paper from the bin and smoothed it out flat on the clean counter. It was a printed summary of a premium high-yield savings account. I stared at the black numbers and the names printed at the very top of the page. The account number belonged to the primary savings fund I had secretly set up for Naomi years ago, a fund she believed was just a modest safety net from her working-class father. However, the names on the official header had been legally altered. Naomi's name had been completely removed from the account ownership. Bradley's name now sat alone at the top of the document, granting him sole legal authority. I ran my finger down the column of recent transactions. Bradley was not just preparing to use Naomi as a guarantor for his toxic corporate loans. He was actively and systematically draining her entire life savings. Massive, unexplainable wire transfers had been routed to unknown offshore routing numbers over the past 48 hours. He was bleeding her dry, transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover his own failures, leaving her completely exposed to his impending financial collapse. The trap had already been sprung on my daughter. I carefully folded the bank statement and slid it into my pocket, the quiet realization settling over me that Bradley had just initiated a war he could not possibly survive. I folded the crumpled bank statement and slipped it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. The paper felt like a burning coal against my chest. I could not simply call Naomi and break her heart based on a single discarded piece of paper. She was deeply in love with Bradley, blinded by his charismatic facade and hollow promises. If I approached her now, Bradley would easily manipulate the situation, twisting the narrative to make me look like a paranoid, controlling old man. I needed absolute, irrefutable proof. I needed the full financial picture before I launched a counterstrike. I walked out to my driveway and climbed into my 1998 Ford pickup. The engine sputtered and coughed before roaring to life a familiar mechanical rhythm that had camouflaged my reality for decades. I shifted into gear and drove away from my quiet suburban street, heading directly toward the towering glass and steel skyline of the downtown financial district. The drive took 40 minutes. The rusted quarter panels of my truck drew sneers from valets and corporate executives as I navigated the pristine avenues. They saw an obsolete blue-collar worker lost in a world of high finance. They had absolutely no idea that I owned the ground beneath their expensive imported shoes. I steered the truck down a narrow, unmarked concrete alleyway tucked between two massive skyscrapers. I pulled up to a heavy steel garage door. There were no signs and no receptionists. I rolled down my window and pressed my thumb against a concealed biometric scanner mounted on the brick wall. A microscopic green laser swept across my fingerprint. A heavy electronic deadbolt disengaged with a loud metallic clack. The steel door rolled upward, revealing a brightly lit, pristine underground parking garage. I drove my rusty truck inside and parked next to a row of armored luxury sedans. I stepped out, my work boots echoing sharply against the polished epoxy floor. I walked toward a reinforced glass elevator at the far end of the garage. I pressed my palm against another biometric panel, granting me access to the subterranean levels. As the elevator descended deep beneath the city streets, I thought about Evelyn. When she passed away 30 years ago, my entire world shattered. I was left alone with a small auto mechanic shop and a massive void in my heart. Instead of drowning in grief, I channeled every ounce of my sorrow into relentless calculating work. I took the modest profits from fixing transmissions and changing brake pads and began aggressively purchasing abandoned commercial real estate. I bought failing strip malls, neglected warehouses, and bankrupt corporate parks. I renovated them quietly, flipped them, and reinvested every single dollar. I constructed a billion-dollar holding firm operating entirely in the shadows through layers of anonymous trusts and proxy boards. I never bought a mansion. I never traded my mechanic overalls for designer suits. I learned early on that visible wealth attracts parasites. Invisible wealth grants you absolute, unmitigated power. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. I stepped into a massive climate-controlled data center. Rows of humming black servers stretched across the room, processing millions of transactions and securing the infrastructure of my empire. At the center of the room sat a massive glass desk covered in high-resolution monitors. Gavin was already waiting for me. Gavin was my chief corporate attorney and lead forensic accountant. He was a ruthless, brilliant man who viewed financial laws not as barriers but as complex puzzles waiting to be dismantled. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and held a tablet in his left hand. I walked over to his desk and placed the crumpled bank statement flat onto the glass surface. I wasted no time with pleasantries. I instructed Gavin to run a complete, unrestricted forensic audit on Bradley and his highly publicized tech startup. I told him to trace every single dollar entering and exiting Bradley's accounts over the past 24 months. Gavin did not ask questions. He immediately began typing rapidly on his keyboard, pulling up deeply encrypted financial databases that only a man with his specific legal clearances could access. The massive monitors flickered to life, displaying a chaotic web of wire transfers, corporate tax filings, and banking ledgers. I stood silently behind him, watching the digital footprint of my prospective son-in-law materialize on the glowing screens. The truth was far worse than a single drained savings account. Gavin spoke with clinical, detached precision as he unraveled the data. He explained that Bradley's tech startup was nothing more than a hollow, bleeding carcass. The company possessed absolutely no proprietary software, no real revenue streams, and no viable business model. Bradley was actively hemorrhaging capital, spending millions on lavish corporate parties, leased exotic cars, and aggressive public relations campaigns to maintain the illusion of success. To hide these massive compounding debts from his elite investors, Bradley had established a complex network of illegal shell companies. He was systematically funneling money out of his own startup to pay off aggressive private creditors, effectively running a high-tech Ponzi scheme. Gavin highlighted a series of recent offshore transactions. He confirmed my worst fear. Bradley was completely draining Naomi's primary savings account, siphoning her liquid cash into these untraceable shell entities to cover his immediate desperate liabilities. He was stripping my daughter of her financial independence days before the wedding. I felt a cold, calculated fury settle deep into my chest. Bradley viewed Naomi not as a partner but as an expendable asset to prolong his inevitable financial collapse. He believed he had successfully outsmarted a naive young woman and her broke, ignorant father. I instructed Gavin to immediately freeze all auxiliary accounts associated with Naomi to prevent any further theft. I was prepared to leave the data center and initiate the process of quietly destroying Bradley's corporate reputation. Gavin did not stop typing. His eyes narrowed on a deeply buried line of code on the far right monitor. He raised his hand, gesturing for me to wait. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard intensified. He bypassed another layer of banking security, accessing the municipal property registry. Gavin slowly turned his leather chair around to face me. His expression was unusually grim, completely devoid of his usual corporate arrogance. He turned the large primary monitor directly toward me. He pointed a steady finger at a scanned legal document displayed brightly on the screen. It was a digital copy of a massive commercial lending agreement underwritten by a predatory private equity firm. The document secured millions of dollars in highly leveraged debt for Bradley's failing company. I read the collateral listed on the loan. It was not Bradley's startup. It was the deed to my modest suburban home. I scanned down to the bottom of the page. My signature sat perfectly replicated on the dotted line. Bradley had not just stolen Naomi's liquid cash. He had successfully forged my signature to place a toxic, unpayable secondary mortgage on my family home. He leveraged the roof over my head to fund his criminal enterprise. This war was no longer about protecting my daughter. It was a requirement for total annihilation. The timeline accelerated rapidly, propelling us toward the rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding. Bradley selected an ultra-exclusive country club on the affluent north side. The venue was a sprawling estate built on inherited wealth, draped in heavy velvet and illuminated by massive crystal chandeliers. I arrived on time wearing the same faded, immaculate suit I had worn to my wife Evelyn's funeral decades ago. It was a calculated choice. I wanted them to see a man who refused to bend to their superficial standards. I stood quietly near the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom, nursing a glass of water. I watched the room operate like a corporate networking event, rather than a celebration of love. Bradley darted between tables of venture capitalists and hedge fund managers, flashing his blinding manufactured smile. He was desperately trying to secure new investors before his house of cards collapsed entirely. Naomi sat alone at the head table, looking isolated amidst the wealthy strangers. My heart ached for my daughter, but I could not reveal the truth yet. The legal trap had to snap shut perfectly tomorrow. I turned away from the main floor and walked down a marble-lined corridor leading toward the restrooms. The loud music from the ballroom became a muffled bass beat. I was halfway down the corridor when two figures stepped out from the shadows, deliberately blocking my path. It was Bradley's parents, Richard and Eleanor. They moved with the predatory grace of people who believed their wealth granted them ownership. Richard wore a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than a vehicle, holding a heavy crystal glass of whiskey. Eleanor wore an evening gown dripping with expensive diamonds, her face pulled tight into an expression of distaste. They did not offer a greeting. They did not smile. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. He thrust it toward my chest with a sharp motion. He spoke in a low, harsh tone, dripping with absolute contempt. He informed me that the envelope contained a certified cashier's check for exactly $10,000. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice a venomous hiss echoing off the walls. She demanded that I take the money, turn around, and never show my face at the wedding ceremony tomorrow morning. She stated that my working-class appearance, my faded suit, and my lack of high society standing would severely embarrass their elite guests. Richard chimed back in, declaring that Bradley was on the verge of securing a massive round of tech funding from the powerful men in the ballroom. He insisted that having a broke ghetto auto mechanic sitting in the front row would completely destroy Bradley's vital networking opportunities and ruin their perfect family image. They looked at me with an expectation of immediate compliance, fully assuming that a desperate man like me would eagerly trade his daughter's wedding day for a quick financial payday. I looked at the crisp white envelope in Richard's outstretched hand. I thought about the forged mortgage documents sitting securely in Gavin's underground data center. I thought about the billions of dollars my hidden holding firm possessed, resources that could buy and liquidate Richard's entire bloodline 10 times over without making a dent in my ledger. I did not raise my voice. I did not betray a single emotion. I simply reached out and took the envelope from his hand. Richard smirked, lifting his whiskey glass to his lips in a gesture of victory. I opened the envelope, pulled out the certified check, and stared at the $10,000 figure. Moving with slow, deliberate precision, I gripped the heavy paper and ripped it exactly in half. The sharp, tearing sound echoed loudly against the walls. Richard lowered his glass, his eyes widening in sudden shock. I slowly ripped the check again, tearing it into 4 perfectly even quarters, and calmly dropped the shredded pieces directly into his crystal whiskey glass. The paper soaked up the expensive liquor, ruining the drink instantly. Eleanor gasped loudly, stumbling backward as if I had physically struck her. Before Richard could formulate a coherent sentence, heavy footsteps pounded down the corridor. Bradley rushed around the corner, his face flushed with panic and sudden rage. He had clearly been watching from the ballroom entrance, waiting to see if his parents' disgusting bribe would succeed. Seeing the shredded check floating in his father's glass, Bradley lost whatever composure he possessed. He lunged toward me, stopping barely an inch from my face. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest and began issuing furious threats. He promised that the absolute second the marriage certificate was signed and filed tomorrow morning, he would deploy his ruthless legal team to file a permanent restraining order against me. He swore he would legally bar me from ever contacting Naomi again, ensuring I would die alone in my pathetic mortgaged house while he took total control of her life and her finances. I stared into Bradley's bloodshot eyes. I recognized the raw desperation of a cornered animal trying to project dominance. I did not offer a single word of defense or retaliation. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my faded suit, stepped to the side, and proceeded to walk past him toward the exit. However, my movement was far from a cowardly retreat. 30 years of handling transmission gears and complex engine schematics had given me exceptionally fast, steady hands. Furthermore, my corporate security division utilized the most advanced military-grade surveillance technology available on the global market. As I brushed my shoulder against Bradley's tailored suit jacket, I executed a flawless, imperceptible sleight of hand. I effortlessly slipped a highly advanced, miniaturized audio-transmitting device directly into the deep exterior pocket of his tuxedo. Bradley was so consumed by his own furious ranting that he failed to notice the tiny weight dropping into his jacket. I continued walking down the marble corridor, leaving the 3 of them standing in stunned, vibrating silence. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the country club and stepped out into the cool night air. The valet brought my rusty pickup truck to the front entrance, looking at me with the same disdain as the rest of the club's patrons. I tipped him generously, climbed into the worn driver's seat, and closed the heavy steel door, sealing myself inside the quiet cabin of my vehicle. I did not start the engine immediately. Instead, I reached into the center console and pulled out a small encrypted digital receiver. I quickly synced it to the frequency of the transmitter currently resting inside Bradley's pocket. I placed a single earpiece into my right ear and turned the volume dial upward. The audio feed was crystal clear, picking up the ambient noise of the grand ballroom as Bradley stomped away from his parents and retreated to an isolated outdoor patio. I heard the sharp clicking of his phone keypad as he rapidly dialed an international number. The line rang twice before a woman answered. Her voice was sultry, laced with a thick Parisian accent. She asked him if the miserable family duties were finally over. Bradley let out a harsh, breathless laugh. He promised her that the nightmare was almost finished. He firmly told her to pack her expensive designer bags and meticulously prepare the penthouse suite. He explicitly promised the woman that they would fly away together to Paris on a chartered jet tomorrow evening. He boasted that the absolute second the state registrar finalized the marriage certificate in the morning, Naomi's massive family trust fund would unlock into a joint account under his control. He was planning to drain her entire legacy, abandon her at the reception, and flee the country with his mistress. I sat in the darkness of my truck, gripping the steering wheel as the audio recording saved securely to my encrypted cloud server. The deadline was set, and the destruction of Bradley's life was officially scheduled for tomorrow morning. The sun rose slowly over the city skyline, casting long, harsh shadows across my gravel driveway. It was the morning of my only daughter's wedding. I sat alone at my small kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching the red digital clock on the wall tick forward relentlessly. Every passing second brought Bradley closer to his ultimate goal. I had spent the entire night sitting in the dark, listening to the intercepted audio recording of him promising a Parisian mistress that he would drain Naomi's trust fund and vanish across the ocean. My initial instinct, born from decades of fiercely protecting my family, was to drive my truck directly to Naomi's bridal suite. I wanted to kick the door open, play the recording at maximum volume, expose Bradley as a predatory monster, and stop the entire wedding before she ever put on her white dress. But I knew my daughter better than anyone. Naomi was deeply empathetic and fiercely proud, discovering the absolute, calculated betrayal of her fiancé just hours before walking down the aisle surrounded by gossiping bridesmaids and high-society wedding photographers would completely break her spirit. She would suffer a public humiliation that would leave permanent psychological scars. I could not let her experience that trauma. I required a surgical solution. I needed to protect her massive financial empire and her physical safety without destroying her heart before the vows were exchanged. The immediate threat was not the elaborate wedding ceremony itself. The ceremony was just a theatrical performance designed to massage Bradley's massive ego. The true danger was the state marriage certificate. Under our specific state laws, the exact moment that official legal document was signed by the ordained officiant and registered with the county clerk, Bradley would automatically gain extensive spousal privileges. He would secure permanent legal access to her remaining liquid assets and the highly lucrative auxiliary trust funds I had established for her when my wife Evelyn passed away. I had to kill the legal binding without stopping the performance. I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed Gavin. My chief corporate attorney answered on the first ring, completely alert despite the early hour. I explained the situation with clinical detachment. We needed to surgically remove the legal teeth from the impending marriage. Gavin operated with a terrifying cold efficiency. He immediately utilized the forensic audit we had conducted at the underground data center the previous day. Because we possessed irrefutable digital proof that Bradley had forged my signature to secure a toxic secondary mortgage on my home, Gavin possessed the necessary federal leverage to initiate a massive legal blockade. Within 20 minutes, Gavin had contacted a powerful federal judge who owed his judicial appointment directly to my holding firm's silent political action committee. Gavin filed a highly classified preemptive fraud injunction against Bradley's entire identity. The judge signed the emergency order without hesitation, temporarily suspending Bradley's legal capacity to enter into any binding financial or marital contracts within the borders of the state. But a court order sitting on a judge's mahogany desk would not physically stop the ink from hitting the paper at the altar. I needed to control the physical document. The county clerk's office utilized a specialized private courier service to deliver expedited marriage licenses to high-profile weekend weddings. This was a logistical vulnerability I could easily exploit. 30 years of building a commercial real estate empire meant I owned the physical leasing contracts for the major courier dispatch centers in the greater metropolitan area. I logged into my secure corporate database and traced the specific delivery route assigned to Naomi's wedding venue. I drove my battered pickup truck to a quiet, tree-lined intersection exactly 2 miles from the country club where the ceremony was taking place. I parked completely out of sight and waited. Precisely at 10 in the morning, the clearly marked courier van pulled up to a red light. I stepped out of my truck and approached the driver's side window. The courier looked confused and slightly alarmed as I flashed a heavy, silver-plated corporate identification badge that designated me as the primary security auditor for his parent company. I instructed him in a firm, unwavering voice to pull over into an empty parking lot for an emergency manifest inspection. He complied immediately, clearly intimidated by the sudden display of corporate authority. I opened the rear doors of his van and easily located the sealed manila envelope addressed to Bradley and Naomi. I did not steal it. I simply presented the courier with the physical copy of the federal fraud injunction Gavin had expedited to my tablet. I explained to the young driver that the individual receiving this specific license was the primary target of an active federal embezzlement investigation, and delivering the legal document would implicate the courier service in federal wire fraud. The driver turned pale and eagerly handed the envelope over to me, desperate to avoid any legal entanglements. I broke the official county seal. I pulled out the authentic, legally binding marriage license. I slid it safely into my interior jacket pocket. In its place, I inserted a meticulously crafted, visually identical document that Gavin had rapidly generated from his extensive legal templates. The replacement paper had the exact same weight, the same elegant borders, and the same official-looking fonts. However, it was completely devoid of any legal watermark, state registry codes, or binding clauses. It was a flawless, legally void prop. I sealed the envelope with a duplicate county sticker I had acquired and handed it back to the courier, instructing him to deliver it exactly on schedule. The extravagant wedding ceremony would proceed perfectly. The expensive string quartet would play their instruments. Naomi would smile brightly and walk down the aisle feeling beautiful. Bradley would confidently sign his name on the dotted line, fully believing he had just successfully secured millions of dollars in matrimonial assets. He would have absolutely no idea he was signing a worthless piece of scrap paper. I returned to my truck and started the rumbling engine. The immediate legal threat to my daughter was completely neutralized. Now it was time for me to attend the lavish reception and spring the ultimate trap. I planned to sit quietly at my assigned table in the dark back corner of the room, wait for the perfect moment during Bradley's arrogant toast, and present him with the corporate foreclosure notice that would end his entire existence. I put my truck in gear and headed toward the sprawling country club. I pulled my faded, meticulously pressed suit jacket over my shoulders, adjusting the cuffs just as my secure phone began to vibrate violently on the passenger seat. I answered the call. It was Gavin. His voice lacked its usual smooth, untouchable arrogance. He sounded intensely tense and uncharacteristically urgent. He informed me that his digital surveillance team had just intercepted a series of frantic, heavily encrypted text messages sent by Bradley to an off-the-book security contractor. Bradley was absolutely terrified by my dead silence after our confrontation at the rehearsal dinner. He knew my attendance at the reception was a massive wild card he could not afford while waiting for the trust funds to miraculously transfer into his accounts. Gavin read the intercepted messages to me verbatim. Bradley had just wired a massive non-refundable cash bonus to a team of highly armed private mercenaries. Their explicit orders were to form a physical, impenetrable barricade around the entire perimeter of the reception hall. They were provided with my photograph and instructed to use extreme physical prejudice to prevent me from entering the venue under any circumstances. Bradley was completely locking down the country club, turning my daughter's wedding reception into a heavily guarded fortress, and I was driving directly into his trap. The echo of my memory faded instantly as the timeline snapped violently back to the present moment on the brightly lit stage. The lavish ballroom was entirely silent save for the ragged, hyperventilating breaths escaping Bradley's throat. He stood before me, completely paralyzed, staring at the federal foreclosure notice trembling in his manicured hands. The color had drained completely from his arrogant face, leaving behind a sickening shade of ash. The crystal champagne glass he had held so triumphantly just moments ago lay shattered in dozens of glittering fragments across the polished hardwood floor, the expensive imported liquor seeping into his custom Italian leather shoes. He read the liquidation terms again, his eyes darting across the heavy premium paper. The absolute finality of his financial destruction was undeniably printed before him, signed and legally executed by the anonymous corporate holding firm he owed $40 million to. A firm that I owned and controlled with absolute authority. The sudden realization of his total ruin shattered his carefully constructed facade of the brilliant, untouchable Silicon Valley tech investor. Bradley let out a visceral, ear-piercing scream. It was not a shout of anger, but a hysterical, high-pitched shriek of pure, unadulterated panic that ripped through the quiet reception hall. The 160 wealthy guests who had just been laughing at his cruel jokes at my expense now sat completely frozen in their seats, watching a man psychologically disintegrate in real time. Bradley's breathing became shallow and erratic. His shoulders heaved. He looked up from the document, his eyes locking onto mine with a look of murderous, unrestrained rage. The cognitive dissonance of being destroyed by the very working-class mechanic he had just publicly humiliated pushed his fragile mind over the edge. He let out a guttural roar, dropping the foreclosure notice onto the stage, and lunged violently toward me. He threw his entire body weight forward, his hands curling into desperate claws, attempting to physically attack me and tear away the source of his corporate demise. He wanted to physically punish the man who had just dismantled his fake life. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to block his incoming assault. I simply stood my ground behind the wooden podium, maintaining my absolute impenetrable stillness. Before Bradley could close the short distance between us, the heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen burst open with explosive force. Two massive, broad-shouldered men stepped out into the grand ballroom. They were dressed in the standard white shirts and black aprons of the venue's catering staff, but they carried themselves with a rigid, highly disciplined posture that had absolutely nothing to do with serving hors d'oeuvres. They were not venue staff. They were elite operatives from my private tactical corporate security team, highly trained professionals I kept on permanent retainer to protect my investments and my family. They moved with terrifying speed and synchronized precision, bypassing the shocked tables of venture capitalists in a fraction of a second. Bradley was mere inches away from grabbing my faded suit jacket when the first operative reached the stage. The security professional did not hesitate. He grabbed Bradley by the collar of his expensive tuxedo and the back of his belt, effortlessly lifting the furious groom completely off his feet. With a single fluid motion, the operative slammed Bradley face down onto the hard wooden surface of the stage. The impact knocked the wind entirely out of Bradley's lungs, silencing his hysterical screams instantly. The second operative stepped up beside them, calmly placing a heavy, immovable knee directly between Bradley's shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the floor. Bradley thrashed and kicked his polished shoes, scraping uselessly against the wood, but he was entirely trapped under the overwhelming physical weight of my private security detail. He resembled a helpless pinned insect, stripped of all his manufactured power and corporate arrogance. A sudden desperate rustle of heavy silk and tulle broke the stunned silence of the room. Naomi pushed her chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. She lifted the heavy layers of her immaculate white wedding gown and sprinted toward the brightly lit stage. Tears were streaming rapidly down her beautiful face, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. She climbed the short stairs, her breath hitching with deep, confused sobs. She looked at her fiancé, pinned helplessly to the floor by two massive strangers, and then looked at me, her eyes begging for a logical explanation. She demanded to know what was happening, her voice trembling with shock and heartbreak. She cried out my name, asking why these men were attacking her future husband, and what I had done to cause this absolute chaos. Seeing the profound pain in my daughter's eyes was the hardest moment of my entire life, but I knew that a brief, agonizing truth was infinitely better than a lifetime of financial slavery and emotional abuse. I did not offer her a verbal apology. Words would not penetrate the thick layer of manipulation Bradley had built around her over the past 2 years. I needed to present undeniable, irrefutable evidence. I reached down to the wooden podium and opened my heavy, worn leather briefcase. I bypassed the stacks of physical documents and pulled out a sleek, high-resolution digital tablet. The device was loaded with the comprehensive, terrifying audit files Gavin had compiled during his forensic investigation. I tapped the glowing screen, opening the specific, highly encrypted audio files labeled exactly as Gavin had sent them to my secure server. The digital evidence was cataloged specifically under the file names Kichban Ong Daden 2_17. DOCX and the corroborating data packet Kichban Ong Daden Mao Motgach Duimoy Beichum DOCX. I turned the volume on the tablet to its maximum setting and held the device up toward the microphone mounted on the podium. I pressed play. The crystal-clear, undeniable audio recording of Bradley's late-night phone call echoed loudly throughout the vast, silent ballroom. The entire room listened in total shock as Bradley's voice filled the air, speaking to his Parisian mistress. The guests heard the explicit, disgusting details of his grand plan. They heard him promise the woman that he would fly away to Paris with her on a chartered jet tomorrow evening. They heard his cruel, arrogant laugh as he boasted that the moment the state registrar finalized the marriage certificate, Naomi's massive family trust fund would automatically unlock into a joint account under his total control. He gleefully outlined his plan to completely drain her entire legacy, abandon her immediately after the reception, and flee the country with his stolen wealth. Naomi stood completely paralyzed, the heavy white fabric of her gown billowing slightly in the draft of the large room. The color drained from her cheeks as the reality of the recording washed over her. The man she loved, the man she had planned to build her entire life with, was exposed as a calculating, predatory monster who viewed her solely as a lucrative financial asset. The sheer weight of the betrayal crushed her spirit instantly. Her knees buckled beneath her. She dropped heavily to the floor of the stage, the layers of her dress collapsing around her like a deflated cloud. She covered her face with both hands, letting out a heartbreaking, agonizing wail of pure sorrow. She realized her entire relationship, her wedding, and her future were nothing more than a meticulously crafted scam to steal her life savings. The wealthy guests in the ballroom began to murmur loudly, their initial shock morphing into intense, aggressive outrage. Investors whispered furiously to one another, realizing they had also been thoroughly conned by Bradley's elaborate corporate lies. However, the most violent reaction did not come from the betrayed investors or my heartbroken daughter. It came from the dimly lit table near the center of the room. Bradley's mother, Eleanor, stood up with terrifying sudden speed. Her face was contorted into a mask of absolute unhinged fury. Her son's fake empire was destroyed, their family name was publicly ruined, and her guaranteed access to my daughter's wealth was permanently severed. She reached down to the formal dining table, her diamond bracelets catching the light of the chandeliers. Her fingers closed tightly around the thick, heavy handle of a serrated silver steak knife. She raised the weapon, the sharp blade glinting menacingly, and let out a furious scream. With her expensive evening gown trailing behind her, Eleanor charged blindly and violently toward the stage. Eleanor's expensive evening gown rustled violently as she scrambled up the short wooden stairs onto the stage, the heavy silver steak knife raised high above her head. Her face was twisted into a grotesque mask of fury, completely abandoning the high society poise she had lorded over me at the rehearsal dinner. She lunged directly for my chest, driven by the sheer desperation of a woman whose fake empire was crumbling. The serrated blade caught the bright glare of the crystal chandeliers, flashing dangerously as she closed the distance. My private security team reacted with terrifying mechanical efficiency. The operative who had his knee planted securely on Bradley's back did not even blink or shift his weight. The first operative, standing perfectly still just seconds prior, stepped smoothly into Eleanor's violent path. He did not strike her. He simply intercepted her wrist with an iron grip, twisting her arm backward with a precise, calculated motion that forced her fingers to instantly release the weapon. The heavy silver knife clattered harmlessly onto the polished hardwood floor, spinning away into the shadows of the stage. The massive operative smoothly redirected her forward momentum, forcing her face down against the wooden surface right next to her pinned, hyperventilating son. Seeing his wife violently disarmed and his son subdued like a common criminal, Richard completely snapped. The thick veins in his neck bulged visibly against his starched white collar, and his arrogant face turned a deep, mottled shade of purple. He marched toward the stage, aggressively pushing past the terrified venture capitalists and the weeping bridesmaids who had gathered near the front tables. Richard did not have a weapon, but he possessed something he believed was infinitely more dangerous. He had his inherited generational wealth. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face and unleashed a torrent of hysterical, spit-fueled threats. He screamed that I had just committed an egregious act of illegal corporate sabotage. He bellowed to the entire silent ballroom that he owned one of the largest industrial manufacturing conglomerates in the state, and that he would marshal his entire legal department to crush me in civil court. He swore he would bleed me dry with endless litigation until my rusty pickup truck and my pathetic suburban house were seized by the banks. He promised to personally ensure I spent the rest of my pathetic working-class life rotting in a maximum security prison cell for domestic terrorism and corporate espionage. He projected his voice so loudly that his vocal cords cracked, desperate to reassure the wealthy investors in the room that the Bradley family still held absolute power. I stood behind the wooden podium, completely unfazed by his theatrical display of rage. I let him scream, I let him exhaust his lungs and thoroughly embarrass himself in front of his elite peers. When he finally paused to draw a ragged, wheezing breath, I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, subtle nod toward the back of the room. From the dense crowd of stunned, whispering guests, a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stepped forward. It was Gavin. My chief corporate attorney moved through the chaotic reception hall with the calm, predatory grace of a shark navigating a school of panicked fish. The wealthy guests instinctively parted for him, recognizing the unmistakable aura of a man who dealt in high-level corporate destruction. Gavin carried a sleek leather portfolio tucked under his left arm. He bypassed my weeping daughter, stepped up the short wooden stairs onto the stage, and walked directly toward Richard. Richard glared at Gavin, his chest heaving rapidly. He clearly recognized Gavin as a man of extreme corporate authority, but he had absolutely no idea who Gavin actually represented. Gavin did not offer a polite greeting or extend his hand. He unzipped his leather portfolio, extracted a thick stack of legally bound papers bearing a prominent red federal seal, and pressed the heavy documents firmly against Richard's chest, forcing the furious man to grab them. Richard looked down at the papers, his purple face twitching with absolute confusion. Gavin spoke in a loud, crystal-clear voice that easily carried across the vast ballroom. He announced that the document was an official, finalized notification of a hostile corporate takeover. Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh, attempting to dismiss the claim as an elaborate joke. He arrogantly stated that his manufacturing company was an impenetrable fortress protected by generations of locked family equity and ironclad board agreements. He called Gavin a delusional amateur. Gavin did not smile. He simply adjusted his glasses and delivered the surgical strike. He informed Richard that his manufacturing company was actually completely insolvent. Gavin methodically revealed to the entire room of investors that Richard had been secretly leveraging his factory equipment and illegally liquidating his employee pension funds to cover his son Bradley's catastrophic venture capital debts. Richard had quietly bled his own legacy dry to fund his son's fake Silicon Valley lifestyle. I stepped out from behind the podium and walked slowly toward Richard. I looked deep into his panicked, darting eyes and explained the final piece of the puzzle. I told him that while he was busy handing me a $10,000 bribe near the restrooms last night, I had silently deployed my acquisition teams. My holding firm had spent the entire night systematically buying up the toxic defaulted debt Richard owed to predatory private equity lenders. Exactly 1 hour prior to the start of this fake wedding ceremony, the heavily leveraged creditors eagerly accepted my massive cash buyout. By purchasing the debt, my anonymous holding firm had legally triggered the default clauses hidden deep within Richard's own corporate bylaws. I had successfully acquired 51% of the controlling shares in his failing manufacturing conglomerate. I owned the factories, the supply chains, and the board of directors. I owned everything his grandfather had built, and I had purchased it using the pocket change from my commercial real estate empire. I did not raise my voice as I delivered the final blow. I spoke with absolute merciless authority. I told Richard that effective immediately, his position as the chief executive officer of the manufacturing company was permanently terminated. I ordered him to surrender his corporate keycards and vacate the premises. The shock of absolute irreversible ruin struck Richard like a physical lightning bolt. The purple flush vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a ghastly pale white. He dropped the heavy legal documents onto the floor, the pages scattering across the stage. His hands shot up to his chest, clutching tightly at the fabric of his expensive tuxedo shirt. He let out a strangled, gasping wheeze. His knees buckled instantly and he collapsed backward into a padded mahogany dining chair, gasping desperately for air as his heart struggled to process the total annihilation of his empire. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Guests screamed and scrambled away from the stage. Several venture capitalists rushed toward the exit, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Bradley family's destruction. Eleanor shrieked hysterically from the floor, struggling uselessly against the iron grip of my security operative. Amidst the deafening panic, Bradley saw his only window of opportunity. The operative, pinning him to the floor, had instinctively turned his head for a fraction of a second to assess Richard's sudden medical collapse. Bradley utilized a surge of pure adrenaline-fueled desperation. He twisted his body violently and kicked his heavy dress shoe directly into the operative's knee joint. The guard grunted and his grip loosened just enough. Bradley scrambled out from under the massive man like a panicked rat. He did not look at his weeping mother on the floor. He did not look at his father gasping for breath in the chair. He certainly did not look at Naomi, who was still kneeling on the stage in her ruined wedding gown. Bradley was only concerned with his own survival. He sprinted off the stage and vaulted over a shattered crystal centerpiece. A terrified wedding guest was standing frozen near the main aisle, holding his car keys loosely in his trembling hand. Bradley charged the young man, violently snatching the keys from his fingers and shoving him hard to the floor. Bradley burst through the heavy brass doors of the ballroom and sprinted out into the valet parking lot. He jumped into the first running vehicle he found, slammed the transmission into gear, and sped away recklessly into the dark night, leaving his entire destroyed life behind him. The stolen luxury sedan tore down the dark roads leading away from the country club. Bradley gripped the leather steering wheel with white knuckles, his chest heaving as adrenaline surged. The digital speedometer climbed past 90 miles an hour. His perfectly tailored tuxedo was soaked in cold sweat, and his mind raced to process the catastrophe he had just fled. His fraudulent tech empire was completely obliterated. His powerful parents were financially ruined, stripped of their generational wealth by a man they underestimated. The elaborate wedding ceremony was exposed as a legally void charade. However, beneath the suffocating layers of panic, a desperate, calculating instinct began to surface. He suddenly remembered the banking credentials. Weeks before the ceremony, under the guise of consolidating marital assets, he had convinced Naomi to transfer her remaining liquid funds into a joint account. He possessed the encrypted passwords and the authentication tokens. His corporate kingdom was gone, but $3 million of Naomi's capital remained sitting in that ledger. If he could reach a secure terminal, he could execute an immediate wire transfer to an offshore account. He just needed 10 undisturbed minutes to complete the transaction and vanish permanently. Back inside the shattered grand ballroom, the chaotic aftermath of the hostile takeover swirled around me. Wealthy guests continued to flee the venue, their expensive heels clicking rapidly against the floors. I did not waste a single second watching Richard gasp for air or Eleanor scream. My sole focus remained entirely on my daughter. I approached Naomi, who was still kneeling on the stage in her ruined wedding gown. I knelt beside her, placing a firm hand on her trembling shoulder. I quietly promised her the nightmare was over, and I would never let anyone harm her again. I instructed 2 security operatives to escort her safely back to her childhood bedroom at my house, guaranteeing her physical protection. I stood up and locked eyes with Gavin. We did not need to exchange a verbal command. We fully understood the immediate vulnerability remaining on the financial board. Bradley was a desperate rat backed into a corner, and a cornered rat would inevitably lunge for the nearest digital exit. We sprinted out of the country club through the service doors, climbed into Gavin's tactical vehicle, and commanded the driver to head directly toward the financial district. We arrived at the concealed alleyway and descended rapidly into the subterranean data center. The cool air of the server room provided a stark contrast to the heated chaos of the wedding reception. Gavin bypassed the biometric scanners and took his position behind the glass desk. The high-resolution monitors flared to life, illuminating the dark room with streams of scrolling banking data. We had to beat Bradley to the digital punch. Gavin rapidly initiated the legal protocols we had prepared. He uploaded the federal fraud injunction, the preemptive order signed by the federal judge earlier that morning, directly into the centralized banking network. Miles away, parked under the flickering neon light of an abandoned roadside motel, Bradley frantically typed on his stolen laptop. He connected to an unsecured wireless network, his hands shaking violently as he bypassed the initial security gates of the joint banking portal. He stared hungrily at the screen, viewing the $3 million balance. He inputted the offshore routing numbers, calculating the exchange rates that would fund his luxurious escape to Paris. He pressed his finger against the digital execute button, waiting for the green confirmation screen that would signal his ultimate victory over my family. Inside the underground data center, Gavin's fingers flew across his mechanical keyboard with terrifying speed. He deployed the federal injunction like a digital missile. The command instantly propagated across every financial institution, credit bureau, and regulatory agency in the country. The trap snapped shut with absolute, unforgiving precision. Bradley's screen suddenly flashed violently. The green confirmation prompt vanished instantly, replaced by a stark, glowing red error message reading "Access denied" and "Account frozen." Bradley frantically mashed the keyboard, attempting to refresh the portal. He tried to access his secondary personal checking accounts. Frozen. He attempted to log into his corporate expense accounts. Terminated. He frantically pulled his premium platinum credit cards from his wallet and attempted to execute a massive cash advance through a third-party vendor. Declined. Gavin turned the primary monitor toward me, his face illuminated by the data streams. He explained that he had not simply frozen the joint account containing Naomi's money. He had initiated a total catastrophic digital lockdown. Every single financial account, credit line, investment portfolio, and liquid asset tied to Bradley's social security number was now completely paralyzed under federal authority. Bradley was no longer just broke. He was digitally erased. He could not buy a plane ticket. He could not rent a hotel room, and he could not purchase a single gallon of gasoline. He was entirely locked out of his own existence, trapped in a stolen vehicle with absolutely zero resources. I stood behind Gavin, watching the red error logs stack up on the monitor as Bradley fruitlessly attempted to breach the frozen accounts. We had successfully severed his final lifeline. I turned to pour a cup of black coffee, preparing to initiate the physical manhunt to retrieve the stolen vehicle, when my encrypted mobile phone began to vibrate on the glass desk. The caller identification display showed an untraceable number heavily masked by a series of rotating international proxy servers. I picked up the device and accepted the incoming connection, remaining completely silent. A sharp, frantic laugh echoed through the speaker. It was a chaotic, unhinged sound completely devoid of the smooth charm Bradley had utilized to deceive my daughter. He was breathing heavily, his voice dripping with pure, venomous malice. He mocked my attempt to freeze his assets. He acknowledged that I had burned his corporate empire to the ground and locked him out of the global banking system. However, he informed me that he had anticipated a secondary contingency. He revealed a terrifying detail. During the chaotic middle of the lavish reception while I was dealing with his parents, he had slipped away from the venue and driven directly to Naomi's private apartment. Bradley gleefully confessed that he had ransacked her secure home office. He had successfully stolen her physical government-issued passport. Even worse, he had cracked her personal safe and stolen a highly encrypted proprietary flash drive. This specific digital drive contained the entire source code and unpatented architectural designs for a revolutionary artificial intelligence software Naomi had spent the last 5 years secretly developing. It was her life's work, a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars on the open market. Bradley's voice dropped into a dark, threatening whisper. He informed me he was currently holding her passport and her entire professional future hostage. He demanded a direct, untraceable cryptocurrency transfer of exactly $5 million. He issued a rigid, non-negotiable ultimatum. If the ransom was not deposited into his decentralized digital wallet by exactly midnight, he would permanently destroy the physical passport and immediately upload the proprietary software source code to a public open-source server, rendering her life's work entirely worthless. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the frantic breathing of a man who had lost his grip on reality. Bradley repeated his extortion demand, his voice cracking with terror and arrogance. $5 million in untraceable cryptocurrency by midnight, or he would obliterate my daughter's entire professional future. He expected me to panic, to beg, or to frantically ask for banking instructions. He believed he had found the leverage to break me. I stared at Gavin's monitors, watching the red error logs of Bradley's frozen accounts scroll endlessly. I spoke with the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner. I told Bradley flatly that I do not negotiate with desperate thieves. I informed him that he had zero leverage and that his deadline was entirely irrelevant. Before he could utter another threat, I disconnected the secure line. I looked across the glass desk at Gavin. My attorney nodded, recognizing the shift in my posture. The financial lockdown was complete. It was time to initiate the physical retrieval. I left the subterranean facility and drove my truck straight to my quiet suburban neighborhood. My private security operatives had secured the perimeter of my property with absolute discretion. I walked through the front door and found Naomi sitting quietly at the small kitchen table. She had shed the ruined layers of her wedding gown, changing into an oversized flannel shirt and sweatpants. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and entirely hollowed out. A cold cup of tea sat untouched in front of her. When she looked up, her eyes were bloodshot. The profound humiliation had settled deep into her bones. She wept quietly, her voice trembling as she confessed her immense feelings of foolishness. She felt stupid for trusting a monster, for believing his charismatic lies, and for tying her heart to a man who viewed her as a profitable stepping stone. She mourned the death of her relationship, but the theft of her proprietary software was a fatal blow to her spirit. 5 years of relentless coding and brilliant architectural design had been stolen in an instant. She believed her life's work was permanently gone, held hostage by a man who would undoubtedly destroy it out of pure spite. I pulled a wooden chair out and sat beside her. I wrapped my arm around her shaking shoulders. I did not offer her empty platitudes. I told her the absolute truth. I promised her that she was brilliant, that her empathy was a strength, and that she was merely the victim of a highly calculated predator. I swore to her on the memory of her mother that I would retrieve her software, secure her passport, and permanently remove Bradley from our lives before the sun rose. Naomi looked at me with a mixture of desperate hope and profound confusion. She asked how I could possibly find him. Bradley was untraceable, operating off the grid with stolen assets, and the police would take days to secure a search warrant. I stood up and pulled my rugged encrypted laptop from my briefcase, setting it flat on the counter. I looked at my daughter and decided it was time to reveal the full extent of my protective paranoia. I asked her where her platinum engagement ring was located. She blinked, caught off guard. She explained that she had placed it securely on her nightstand in her bedroom before putting on her bridal gloves this morning. She realized instantly that Bradley must have scooped it up along with her passport and the flash drive during his frantic robbery. I nodded, a hard smile forming on my face. I opened a specialized tracking application on my screen. I explained to Naomi that the moment Bradley had purchased that expensive engagement ring a year ago, my instincts had flared violently. I recognized his predatory nature long before he asked for a loan. I could not forbid her from marrying him, but I could track his movements. Using my corporate security division, I had quietly intercepted the jeweler's courier. My technicians had embedded a microscopic military-grade GPS transmitter deep inside the thick platinum band before Naomi ever opened the velvet box. Bradley thought he was stealing jewelry to pawn for quick cash. In reality, he had unknowingly pocketed a federal-grade tracking beacon. I typed commands into the terminal. The screen rapidly loaded a high-resolution satellite map of the greater metropolitan area. A bright pulsing red dot materialized instantly on the digital grid. The beacon was broadcasting a flawless, uninterrupted signal. I zoomed in on the coordinates. Bradley had not fled to a private airport or a luxury downtown safe house. The red dot was stationary at an isolated, decaying property located on the furthest rural outskirts of the county. It was a condemned roadside motel completely devoid of any modern technology or functional security cameras. It was the fitting destination for a man who had lost his entire fake empire. I closed the laptop and picked up my keys. I gave Naomi strict instructions to lock all the doors, stay away from the windows, and let my security detail handle the entire exterior perimeter. I walked out to my truck, dialing my lead tactical operative as I climbed into the cab. I transmitted the GPS coordinates and ordered 2 heavily armored vehicles to meet me at the remote target location. I drove aggressively through the dark country roads, pushing my roaring engine to its absolute mechanical limit. The streetlights vanished, replaced by dense woods and the suffocating darkness of the desolate rural county edge. The flickering, broken neon sign of the abandoned motel finally cut through the gloom. The parking lot was overgrown with thick weeds and littered with shattered glass. Bradley's stolen vehicle was parked haphazardly behind a rusted commercial dumpster attempting to hide from the main highway. I pulled my truck up, silently cutting the headlights. My tactical security team arrived seconds later, their black vehicles rolling to a halt without making a sound. 4 massive men stepped out into the damp night air wearing full tactical gear and moving with silent precision. We approached Unit Number 7. The red beacon on my mobile device confirmed the ring was located exactly 10 feet ahead. A faint flickering blue light spilled from the edges of the drawn curtains, indicating a laptop screen was powered on inside. I did not knock. I did not announce my presence or offer a final warning. I stepped squarely in front of the rotting wooden door, raised my heavy steel-toed work boot, and kicked the lock mechanism with bone-shattering force. The weak wooden frame splintered instantly. The heavy door ripped off its rusted hinges and crashed violently onto the dirty carpet inside. I stepped into the dim, foul-smelling room. Bradley spun around from a cheap plastic desk, his face pale, drenched in sweat, and twisted with absolute terror. He was completely cornered. His tech empire was gone, his bank accounts were frozen, and his escape plan was ruined. Driven by pure, unhinged desperation, Bradley raised a heavy, loaded revolver and aimed the shaking barrel directly at the exact center of my chest. I refused to take a single step backward into the night. The heavy steel barrel of the revolver trembled violently, inches from my sternum. Bradley stood cornered in the filthy motel room, the dim glow of his stolen laptop casting harsh shadows across his face. Sweat poured profusely down his forehead, soaking the collar of his ruined tuxedo. His eyes were bloodshot and completely unhinged. He was no longer the smooth, charismatic investor who had manipulated my daughter. He was a trapped animal operating on pure primal panic. He gripped the weapon with both hands, his finger twitching erratically against the trigger. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by his ragged breaths. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands. I planted my boots firmly on the stained carpet, keeping my posture relaxed and my gaze locked onto his panicked eyes. Bradley swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he screamed his demands. He ordered me to reach into my pocket and pull out my mobile banking device. He demanded that I open my primary corporate application and execute an immediate, untraceable wire transfer of $5 million directly into his offshore cryptocurrency wallet. He shrieked that if he did not see the confirmation screen glow green within 60 seconds, he would pull the trigger, leave my bleeding body on the floor, and upload Naomi's proprietary software code to the public domain. He stepped closer, the cold metal of the gun brushing against the fabric of my suit jacket. He let out a hysterical laugh, trying desperately to convince himself he was still in control. He ranted that I had ruined his life, destroyed his parents, and locked him out of his identity, but he was going to walk away with the ultimate prize. He boasted that killing an intruder in a cheap motel room would be an easy mess to clean up, especially with $5 million of fresh capital to buy a new identity in Europe. He threatened that Naomi would not only lose her father tonight, but she would also lose her life's work and her entire future. He wanted me to drop to my knees, plead for my life, and offer him the financial salvation he craved. But I refused to give him the satisfaction. I knew engaging with a hysterical coward was a tactical error. Panic feeds on reaction. Absolute, impenetrable stillness is the only effective countermeasure to chaos. I maintained unbroken eye contact, analyzing his stance, his grip, the trajectory of the barrel, and the distance between my hand and his weapon. I knew that the moment I transferred that money, he would shoot me anyway. He was too desperate to leave witnesses. I had no intention of funding his escape. Bradley screamed again, demanding to know why I was not moving. He ordered me to take out the phone and authorize the transfer immediately. I complied, but not in the manner he expected. I moved with deliberate, agonizing slowness, telegraphing my actions to ensure he did not panic and pull the trigger prematurely. I slowly reached my right hand into the interior pocket of my tailored jacket. Bradley watched my hand intently, the revolver shaking violently as he barked instructions warning me not to try anything foolish. My fingers brushed past my wallet and closed firmly around my heavily modified encrypted mobile phone. I did not pull the device out. I did not unlock the screen or open a banking application. My thumb found the textured programmable hardware button located on the top edge of the device. This specific button was directly linked to a remote override command I had established with Gavin and my tactical security team. I maintained my cold, unblinking stare into Bradley's terrified eyes. I pressed the button firmly. Instantly, the motel room plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The glowing laptop screen on the desk snapped off. The flickering neon sign buzzing outside the window died. The distant hum of the ice machine in the corridor ceased. My tactical security operatives had not simply cut the power line to unit number 7. They had physically severed the primary power grid to the entire block. Total sensory deprivation enveloped the room in a fraction of a second. Bradley let out a sharp gasp of shock, the sudden darkness completely disorienting his panicked mind. He stumbled backward, his night vision entirely compromised by the abrupt transition from the harsh laptop glare to total blackness. He swung the heavy revolver blindly through the empty air, shouting my name, demanding to know what I had done. The tactical advantage shifted immediately. I had anticipated the blackout. My eyes had already begun adjusting to the shadows, and my physical positioning remained deeply rooted in my spatial awareness of the small room. I stepped silently to my left, moving completely out of his line of fire, becoming a phantom in the darkness. Bradley backed up until his shoulders slammed against the cheap wooden paneling. He was hyperventilating the gun, shaking wildly in the dark. He threatened to fire blindly into the room if I did not turn the lights back on. Before he could make good on his reckless threat, the dense darkness of the room was suddenly shattered. Piercing, rhythmic flashes of brilliant red and blue light flooded violently through the broken, dusty blinds of the motel window. The intense strobing colors illuminated the filthy carpet, the shattered doorframe, and Bradley's sweat-drenched face in harsh, rapid intervals. The deafening wail of multiple high-decibel sirens pierced the quiet rural night, rapidly approaching the abandoned parking lot from all directions. The heavy crunch of specialized tires sliding to a halt on the gravel echoed loudly outside the thin walls. Bradley looked at the flashing red and blue lights painting the walls. The pure terror on his face morphed into a sick, twisted smile. His desperation twisted into an arrogant delusion. He let out a harsh, triumphant laugh over the blaring sirens. He looked into the shadows and mocked me for making a fatal mistake. He sneered that calling the local police was the dumbest move I could have made. He boasted that he was an unarmed man chased by a crazed, trespassing father-in-law. He declared he would drop the revolver, raise his hands, and explain to the deputies that I had kicked down his door. He promised to claim self-defense against a violent home invader, assuring me his lawyers would have me arrested for assault. He reveled in his perceived victory. I stepped out of the shadows, the strobing lights illuminating my stoic expression. I moved silently until I stood inches away. The sirens wailed outside, accompanied by shouting of armed men taking tactical positions. I did not raise my voice. I leaned in and spoke with cold finality. I whispered into his ear, shattering his illusion. I informed him I did not call the local police. I told him local deputies do not respond to corporate espionage, massive wire fraud, and the theft of classified software source code. I watched the smile vanish instantly as reality crushed him. I whispered that the men outside were not local cops. I had called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The word FBI hung in the stagnant air of the motel room like a physical weight. Bradley's twisted smile vanished instantly, replaced by a hollow, uncomprehending stare. He processed the acronym slowly, his panicked brain struggling to reconcile his perceived superiority with the catastrophic reality of federal involvement. He opened his mouth to speak, but the deafening shatter of safety glass and the explosive breach of the motel door interrupted his final threat. The fragile wooden frame, already compromised by my initial kick, was entirely obliterated as heavily armored federal agents swarmed the cramped space. High-intensity tactical flashlights cut through the darkness, blinding Bradley and painting the stained walls with erratic beams of white light. Multiple assault rifles locked directly onto his chest. Deafening commands filled the room, ordering him to drop the weapon immediately. The heavy revolver slipped from Bradley's trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. He raised his hands, his knees buckling under the sheer, overwhelming presence of federal authority. Two agents lunged forward, slamming him aggressively against the cheap wall paneling. They wrenched his arms behind his back, securing heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists with a sharp metallic snap. Bradley did not fight back. He went entirely limp, hyperventilating as they dragged his completely ruined tuxedo out the door and shoved him into the back of a waiting armored transport vehicle. I stepped calmly toward the plastic desk, retrieved Naomi's physical passport, and securely pocketed the encrypted flash drive containing her proprietary software. The physical threat was neutralized, but the psychological demolition was only just beginning. The glaring, sterile fluorescent lights of the federal interrogation room buzzed with a low, incessant hum. It was early the next morning. Bradley sat handcuffed to a heavy steel ring bolted securely to the center of a scratched metal table. His expensive custom tuxedo was torn, stained with sweat, and reeked of the cheap motel carpet. Yet his posture radiated an intense, infuriating arrogance. The initial shock of the midnight raid had worn off, replaced by the deep, ingrained delusion of a man who firmly believed wealth and manipulation could buy him out of any consequence. He leaned back in his uncomfortable metal chair, a sickeningly smug expression plastered across his face. He stared down the two exhausted federal detectives sitting across from him. They had presented him with towering stacks of physical evidence, including the fraudulent mortgage documents, the unauthorized wire transfers, and the intercepted audio recordings. Bradley simply rolled his eyes and laughed a harsh, arrogant laugh. He confidently informed the detectives that they were wasting their time. He dismissed the overwhelming mountain of financial evidence as a minor clerical error, a simple misunderstanding of complex corporate restructuring that their low-level government salaries could never possibly comprehend. He leaned forward, rattling his steel cuffs against the table, and boldly declared that he had absolutely nothing to fear. He bragged loudly about his high-priced corporate defense attorney. He boasted that he retained a legal shark from the most ruthless, aggressive law firm in the state, a man who charged $1,000 an hour and specialized in destroying federal embezzlement charges through obscure, impenetrable legal loopholes. Bradley sneered at the detectives, promising them that his attorney would arrive within the hour, tear their entire investigation to shreds, and have him walking out of the federal building a free man before they even went to their lunch break. He was absolutely convinced he was untouchable. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room unlocked with a loud, echoing mechanical clank. The two federal detectives immediately stopped their questioning. They stood up from the metal table, gathered their case files, and stepped respectfully backward, completely yielding the floor. They did not utter a single word of protest. I walked slowly into the cold, windowless room. I wore a fresh, meticulously pressed dark suit, carrying a simple styrofoam cup of black coffee in my right hand. I did not look at the federal agents. I did not glance at the two-way mirror on the wall. I walked directly to the opposite side of the steel table and pulled out the metal chair. The sheer display of unseen, overwhelming influence silenced the room entirely. The fact that a civilian could effortlessly command federal detectives to vacate an active interrogation simply by walking through the door finally sent a visible tremor of doubt through Bradley's rigid posture. Bradley stared at me, his smug facade fracturing instantly. The arrogant smirk melted off his face, replaced by a deep, sudden surge of defensive rage. He slammed his cuffed hands against the table, the chain rattling violently against the steel bolt. He demanded to know how I had gained access to a secure federal facility. He screamed that my presence was a blatant violation of his civil rights and definitive proof of illegal entrapment. His voice grew louder, shriller, bouncing aggressively off the concrete walls. He pointed his chained hands at me and vowed absolute retribution. He shrieked that the moment his high-priced lawyer walked through that metal door, he was initiating a massive, uncompromising civil lawsuit against me. He swore to sue me for assault, corporate espionage, and illegal financial sabotage. He demanded to see his attorney immediately, screaming that my pathetic attempts to intimidate him would result in the total liquidation of my real estate holdings to pay his damages. I remained completely silent. I did not attempt to interrupt his hysterical rant. I sat perfectly still, maintaining an emotionless, impenetrable gaze, taking a slow, measured sip of my black coffee. I watched him desperately cling to the illusion of his impending legal salvation. He truly believed his expensive defense attorney was a magical shield that would miraculously deflect the devastating consequences of his actions. I placed the styrofoam cup down on the scratched metal table with a soft thud. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room opened for the second time. The loud mechanical clank echoed sharply through the tight space. A tall, impeccably groomed man in a custom-tailored navy suit stepped into the fluorescent light. He carried a pristine leather briefcase and wore the distinct predatory expression of a top-tier corporate defense attorney. Bradley's face lit up with immediate, overwhelming relief. A vicious, triumphant grin spread across his sweating face. He leaned forward, straining against his handcuffs, and ordered the lawyer to get him out of the room immediately. He loudly commanded the attorney to file an emergency motion for release and to begin drafting the civil lawsuit that would completely destroy my life. Bradley waited for his high-priced legal savior to strike me down. The lawyer did not say a word to Bradley. He did not acknowledge the frantic commands or the arrogant grin. He did not even look at the man handcuffed to the table. The attorney walked purposefully past Bradley's chair, his expensive leather shoes clicking softly against the concrete floor. He crossed the small room and stepped directly behind my chair. He stopped adjusting his suit jacket and stood perfectly still, positioning himself respectfully behind my right shoulder. The lawyer opened his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of finalized federal indictments, and placed them neatly onto the table right next to my coffee cup. He folded his hands behind his back and waited for my instruction. Bradley's triumphant smile froze. His eyes darted frantically from the lawyer to me and then back to the lawyer. The cognitive dissonance crashed into his brain with the force of a freight train. His breathing stopped entirely. He looked at the attorney, begging for an explanation, his voice dropping to a terrified, pathetic whisper. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the cold steel table. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute, crushing finality. I explained to Bradley that the prestigious, aggressive law firm he had paid millions of dollars to retain, the impenetrable legal fortress he believed would save him from federal prison, was actually a quiet, fully owned subsidiary of my central holding company. I owned the partners, I owned the associates, and I owned his specific defense attorney. I told him that his representation had been permanently officially withdrawn due to a catastrophic conflict of interest. Bradley was utterly, entirely alone, completely isolated from the outside world, without a single dollar, without a friend, and without any legal representation to save him from decades in a federal penitentiary. The crushing reality of his isolation left Bradley paralyzed in the sterile interrogation room, staring at the brick walls as his federal charges registered. Word of his complete lack of legal representation spread quickly. Richard and Eleanor, banished from their own manufacturing conglomerate and hiding inside their sprawling suburban mansion, received the devastating news before noon. They had lost their factories, their executive titles, and their social standing, but they still possessed a venomous instinct for survival. They were unwilling to accept defeat. They refused to watch their only son rot in a federal penitentiary for the next 3 decades. Driven by parental desperation and pure malice, they decided to launch a vicious, scorched earth counterattack. If they could not beat me in a legitimate court of law, they would destroy my family in the court of public opinion. Richard utilized his hidden liquid assets to hire a notoriously sleazy tabloid journalist, a man who specialized in manufacturing corporate scandals for the highest bidder. The objective was simple. They needed to craft a fabricated narrative that positioned Bradley as a naive, innocent tech entrepreneur who had been maliciously framed by a violent underground criminal syndicate. The journalist worked rapidly, flooding digital media outlets, gossip blogs, and financial rumor forums with highly sensationalized fake articles. The headlines screamed wild accusations. They painted me as a ruthless mob boss operating under the guise of a commercial real estate investor. They claimed I used militant enforcement tactics to illegally seize Richard's empire. Worst of all, they aggressively targeted Naomi. The articles falsely claimed her revolutionary artificial intelligence software was funded by laundered cartel money and that she was a manipulative grifter who lured Bradley into a financial trap. The smear campaign was a calculated extortion attempt. Richard and Eleanor intended to utterly destroy Naomi's professional reputation, making her proprietary software completely toxic to any legitimate investor. They wanted to inflict so much public humiliation that I would be forced to the negotiating table. Their ultimate goal was to demand a settlement where I would drop all federal embezzlement charges against Bradley and return the manufacturing company in exchange for a complete public retraction of the defamatory articles. The digital assault hit Naomi hard. She sat in my kitchen, her eyes scanning the horrific headlines scrolling across her tablet screen. The public assassination of her character just days after enduring the profound trauma of a shattered wedding was a heavy burden. She felt an agonizing sense of foolishness for ever allowing these monsters into her life. She watched her brilliant, hard-earned professional reputation being dragged through the mud by anonymous internet commentators. She looked at me, her voice shaking with distress, asking if we needed to hire a public relations firm or issue a defensive statement to the press to clear our names. She wanted to fight back loudly to scream the truth from the rooftops. I poured a cup of black coffee and sat down across from my daughter, my posture radiating absolute unwavering calm. I firmly refused to entertain the idea of a public relations battle. I explained to Naomi that engaging with professional liars in a public forum only legitimizes their fabricated claims. A defensive statement would only fuel the tabloid fires and give Richard the exact leverage he desperately craved. I do not negotiate with extortionists, and I certainly do not play theatrical media games. I move in total silence. I required a weapon far more devastating than a press release. I required undeniable truth. I signaled Gavin, who had been sitting quietly in the adjoining room monitoring the digital fallout. Gavin stepped into the kitchen, opening his encrypted laptop. I explained to Naomi the true nature of my counterstrike. When I executed the hostile takeover of Richard's manufacturing conglomerate hours before the wedding, I did not just acquire the factories and the supply chains. I gained unrestricted access to the deepest, most secure levels of their corporate servers. I possessed every internal accounting file, every hidden ledger, and every deleted transaction from the past 15 years. While Richard was busy paying tabloids to invent lies about my family, Gavin and my team of forensic accountants had been methodically dissecting the grim reality of Richard's empire. Gavin turned his laptop screen toward Naomi. Displayed on the monitor was a single pristine financial ledger. It was an internal, highly classified spreadsheet that Richard and Eleanor had fought desperately to keep hidden from their board of directors. The numbers told a story of profound, unforgivable greed. The ledger contained absolute, irrefutable proof that Richard's manufacturing company had been technically bankrupt for over a decade. To maintain their lavish country club lifestyle fund, their sprawling estate, and quietly cover Bradley's endless stream of failed Silicon Valley ventures, Richard and Eleanor had been systematically committing massive corporate fraud. They had illegally drained the private pension funds of their own blue-collar factory employees. For 10 years, the hard-working men and women on Richard's assembly lines had been contributing portions of their paychecks to a retirement fund that no longer existed. Richard and Eleanor had stolen millions of dollars from their most vulnerable workers, siphoning the cash into offshore shell companies to buy imported cars and designer jewelry. It was a despicable, cowardly crime. The ledger meticulously detailed every stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every fraudulent wire transfer authorized directly by Richard and Eleanor. I did not send this explosive ledger to the tabloids. I did not leak it to the gossip blogs to counter their smear campaign. I bypassed the media entirely. I instructed Gavin to transmit the raw, verified, unredacted financial ledger directly to the State Labor Board, the Federal Pension Regulatory Commission, and the District Attorney's Office for corporate fraud. The transmission was instantaneous, secure, and completely devastating. The federal authorities did not require a press conference to understand the magnitude of the crime presented to them. The meticulous data provided by Gavin left zero room for legal interpretation or highly priced defense maneuvers. The evidence of systematic decade-long pension theft was undeniable and catastrophic. The regulatory agencies moved with unprecedented speed, recognizing the immediate threat to hundreds of working-class families who had been robbed of their life savings. The tabloid journalist Richard hired immediately dropped the fake story, terrified of being indicted as an accessory to a massive federal fraud ring. The ultimate consequence of Richard and Eleanor's desperate media attack was swift and absolute. Before the evening news cycle could attempt to report on the fabricated mobster rumors, the focus violently shifted. Federal prosecutors, armed with the undeniable proof from the stolen ledger, immediately issued federal arrest warrants for both Richard and Eleanor. They were formally charged with massive corporate embezzlement, pension fraud, and grand larceny. The parents who had spent the morning attempting to destroy my daughter's reputation through cheap lies were now facing the total destruction of their own lives through the undeniable power of truth. Their sprawling suburban mansion, the fortress where they plotted their malicious smear campaign, was no longer a safe haven. It was now a target for a federal raid. The flashing red and blue lights of the massive federal raid on Richard and Eleanor's sprawling suburban estate heavily dominated the early morning news cycle. I stood alone in my kitchen holding a cup of black coffee, watching the silent television screen. The immediate suffocating threat of the vicious, calculated media smear campaign had been entirely neutralized. The arrogant masterminds who had funded Bradley's fake empire were currently sitting in federal holding cells, stripped of their wealth and facing decades of incarceration for stealing their employees' pension funds. I finally turned the television off, allowing the quiet peace of my home to finally wash over me. Naomi was safely asleep upstairs, slowly recovering from the profound trauma of her shattered wedding. I genuinely believed the complex chessboard had been cleared. The hostile corporate takeover was successful, the assets were frozen, and my daughter was secure. My encrypted mobile phone suddenly vibrated against the granite countertop, shattering the brief illusion of victory. It was Gavin. He did not offer a customary greeting or congratulate me on the successful federal indictments. His voice was incredibly tight, entirely stripped of its usual smooth, arrogant detachment. He demanded I return to the subterranean data center immediately. He had spent the entire night running microscopic autonomous auditing scripts through Bradley's frozen digital footprint and stumbled across a terrifying financial anomaly. I left my coffee untouched, grabbed my truck keys, and drove rapidly back into the city limits, a dark knot of pure dread tightening in my chest. I bypassed the heavy biometric security scanners and strode directly into the chilled, humming server room. Gavin stood rigid behind the glass desk, his pale face illuminated by the harsh white glare of the primary high-resolution monitor. He pointed a shaking finger at a single line of code isolated on the screen. It was a massive recurring wire transfer systematically routed through 3 different international shell companies before finally landing in a highly encrypted offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. Gavin explained the chilling context. While Bradley was actively defaulting on major venture capital loans and frantically begging his father for emergency cash infusions to maintain his fake Silicon Valley lifestyle, he had never missed a single premium payment on this specific external routing number. The monthly charge was astronomical, bleeding tens of thousands of dollars from his dwindling corporate reserves. I demanded to know the exact identity of the recipient institution. Gavin ran a relentless reverse trace on the international routing sequence. He bypassed the standard offshore privacy firewalls, using administrative backdoors we had acquired during the hostile takeover of Richard's manufacturing conglomerate. The destination was not a decentralized cryptocurrency exchange or a hidden private equity firm. It was a highly specialized, entirely unregulated international life insurance syndicate known globally for underwriting extreme high-risk policies without requiring standard medical examinations or lengthy waiting periods. A cold, heavy sweat broke out across my neck. A desperate, heavily indebted con artist does not funnel his last remaining dollars into an offshore life insurance premium unless he expects an imminent, massive financial payout. I needed the exact legal parameters of that specific policy immediately. I pulled my secure mobile phone from my suit jacket and utilized a deep contact I had carefully cultivated decades ago within international banking regulatory enforcement. I offered a substantial, entirely untraceable corporate favor in exchange for a rapid, illegal breach of the Cayman firm's client ledger. 10 minutes later, a heavily encrypted data packet materialized on Gavin's primary monitor. Gavin rapidly decrypted the file and opened the original scanned policy contract. The stark black words on the digital screen hit me with the kinetic force of a physical blow. The document meticulously outlined a comprehensive $10 million life insurance policy. The sole uncontestable beneficiary listed on the binding contract was Bradley. The insured party was my only daughter, Naomi. My hands gripped the edge of the glass desk so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. Gavin pulled up the digital timestamp of the initial electronic signature. Bradley had intentionally purchased and officially activated this massive death benefit exactly 3 weeks before the wedding ceremony. The timeline was sickeningly precise and utterly devoid of humanity. He had successfully secured her absolute trust, isolated her remaining liquid capital into a vulnerable joint account, and immediately placed a $10 million bounty directly on her head. The calculated theft of her proprietary artificial intelligence software and the planned draining of her family trust fund were merely the initial phases of his grand exit strategy. His ultimate financial parachute required her absolute permanent physical elimination. The reality of Bradley's pure predatory evil thoroughly saturated the quiet server room. He was not simply a narcissistic corporate grifter searching for an easy payday. He was a calculated, remorseless killer actively setting the stage for a highly profitable tragedy. I instructed Gavin to immediately dissect the specific insurance broker who had actively facilitated the offshore underwriting process. Gavin deployed a localized aggressive digital assault on the broker's private communications servers. He threatened to expose the corrupt firm's illegal money laundering practices to federal authorities unless they immediately surrendered all internal correspondence regarding Bradley's account. The panicked broker complied within seconds, dumping a massive cache of internal audio logs directly onto our secure network. Gavin quickly isolated the most recent file, a recorded telephone consultation between Bradley and the insurance underwriter scheduled just days before the wedding reception. I commanded Gavin to play the audio file at maximum volume. Bradley's smooth, arrogant voice filled the underground data center. He was eagerly discussing the finalized itinerary for their upcoming honeymoon. Naomi firmly believed they were flying to a luxury beach resort in the Maldives. The audio recording revealed a completely different, terrifying destination. Bradley had secretly booked an isolated off-the-grid cabin located deep within the treacherous, unmapped northern mountains. He enthusiastically described the rugged, dangerous terrain to the broker, heavily emphasizing the sheer vertical drops and the total lack of cellular reception in the specific area. Then the audio captured the most chilling, sociopathic sequence of words I had ever heard. Bradley explicitly inquired about the exact investigative protocols and the expected payout timeline for an accidental death occurring during a remote, unsupervised hiking trip. He calmly asked the broker if the firm required an official local police report or if a simple coroner's declaration of accidental blunt force trauma would legally suffice to release the $10 million into his account. He was meticulously finalizing the logistical details of my daughter's murder. He planned to push her off a mountain, collect the massive insurance money, and vanish into the shadows a multimillionaire. The recording ended, leaving a suffocating heavy silence in the subterranean room. The hostage situation at the abandoned motel had just violently escalated from a high-stakes corporate retrieval mission into a desperate fight for absolute survival. Bradley was no longer just a panicked thief holding intellectual property for ransom. He was an exposed, heavily armed murderer who now had absolutely nothing left to lose. I slowly turned away from the glowing monitors, my field of vision narrowing with a cold, unrelenting, lethal focus. The suffocating chill of the federal holding cell offered Bradley no comfort. He paced the concrete floor, his tuxedo clinging to his trembling frame. The heavy metal door echoed with a loud thud. A uniformed guard stepped aside, gesturing for him to exit. Standing in the sterile hallway was a greasy bail bondsman. This man was a shadow operator embedded in Richard's old underground lending syndicates. Richard had utilized his last hidden assets to secure his son's immediate release. Bradley walked out into the blinding morning sun. He retrieved his confiscated belongings, including a burner phone his father had smuggled into his personal effects. The moment he powered the device on the screen illuminated with an urgent message. It was from a panicked mole inside the offshore insurance brokerage. Federal authorities had subpoenaed the $10 million life insurance policy. The regulators had seized the audio recordings detailing the remote mountain cabin. The charges were no longer limited to corporate embezzlement. The federal prosecutors were actively drafting an arrest warrant for premeditated attempted murder. The weight of the impending murder charge crushed Bradley's arrogant delusion. Embezzlement meant a comfortable federal camp. Premeditated murder meant maximum security and decades of isolation. Pure panic hijacked his nervous system. He knew federal agents would knock on his door within the hour. He had a razor-thin window to vanish. Bradley sprinted from the Federal Plaza, navigating back alleys until he reached an anonymous storage facility. His trembling hands fumbled with the padlock. Inside a rusted locker sat a heavy canvas duffel bag. He unzipped the compartment, revealing stacks of banded $100 bills. It was his emergency stash, untraceable physical currency skimmed from Naomi's accounts over the past year. He threw the heavy bag over his shoulder, the cash offering a false sense of security. He used his burner phone to access a discreet aviation charter service. He booked a long-range private jet under a fabricated corporate alias, paying triple the standard rate for zero security questions and immediate tarmac access. He ordered the pilot to file a flight plan for a non-extradition country. Deep inside the subterranean data center, digital alarms flared. Gavin's fingers flew across the keyboards, tracking the sudden movement of dark money through the county bail system. I stood behind him, watching the financial transaction unravel on the primary monitor. I recognized the dirty signature of the bail bondsman. Richard was making his final play to save his son. Gavin rapidly isolated the signal from Bradley's activated burner phone. We watched the glowing red dot move erratically away from the federal building, pause at the industrial storage facility, and shoot directly toward the southern highway. A cornered predator facing a murder charge seeks the anonymity of a private luxury airfield. Gavin breached the booking servers of every private aviation company within a 50-mile radius. Within seconds, a massive cash deposit triggered a red flag at an isolated charter strip 30 miles south of the city limits. The flight plan indicated an immediate international departure. I knew contacting the federal agents would be a fatal tactical error. Bureaucracy demands patience. Federal agents require official jurisdictional approvals and drawn-out briefings before deploying to a civilian airfield. Bradley would be thousands of feet in the air before the authorities fueled their pursuit vehicles. I refused to let the man who plotted to murder my daughter slip away into tropical exile. I turned away from the monitors and walked toward the underground garage. I bypassed the sleek armored corporate vehicles favored by my security team. Instead, I walked over to my heavily weathered pickup truck. It was the same battered vehicle I drove daily, the perfect mechanical camouflage. A luxury SUV would trigger the airfield's perimeter security. An old, mud-splattered work truck belonged in the background, invisible to the arrogant eyes of private wealth. I climbed into the torn leather seat, turned the ignition, and listened to the roaring hum of the modified engine. I drove out into the harsh daylight, pushing the truck to its absolute limits, navigating the southern highways with aggressive precision. The private airfield was surrounded by tall fencing and pristine landscaping. I veered off the paved road to a secluded maintenance gate. I snapped the flimsy padlock with heavy bolt cutters and pushed the rusted gate open. I drove my battered truck directly onto the smooth tarmac, parking in the obscure shadow of a massive aluminum hangar. I killed the engine and watched. 200 yards away, a brilliant white Gulfstream jet sat idling on the runway. The massive turbines whined with deafening power, generating heat distortion in the morning air. The boarding stairs were lowered, extending an invitation to absolute freedom. Minutes later, Bradley's stolen vehicle skidded erratically through the main gates. He slammed the brakes, abandoning the running car. He sprinted toward the jet, his expensive shoes slapping loudly against the pavement. He clutched the heavy canvas duffel bag to his chest, his face pale, drenched in sweat. He scrambled up the steep metal stairs, consumed by the promise of escape. Bradley burst into the luxurious cabin of the private jet. The interior was a masterpiece of opulent design, featuring plush leather seating, polished mahogany paneling, and ambient lighting. A flight attendant in a crisp uniform stood quietly near the galley, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Bradley did not offer a greeting. He threw the canvas duffel bag onto the polished wooden counter. He unzipped the top, violently pulling out several thick bands of $100 bills. He tossed the cash directly onto the floor at her feet. He screamed at the attendant, ordering her to secure the main cabin door immediately. He demanded that she ignore standard safety protocols, skip the pre-flight checks, and command the pilot to initiate maximum thrust the second the door was sealed tight. He stumbled backward, dropping his exhausted, trembling body into a wide leather seat. He closed his eyes, his chest heaving violently with every breath. He let out a ragged laugh, tasting the sweet, undeniable air of total victory. He believed he had outsmarted the federal government, outmaneuvered his father's powerful enemies, and successfully secured his permanent freedom. The flight attendant did not flinch. She ignored the scattered money on the floor, reached forward, and pulled the external lever, sealing the cabin door with a pressurized hiss. At the front of the aircraft, the reinforced cockpit door stood wide open. The pilot sat facing the illuminated glass panels, his hands moving rhythmically over the array of glowing switches. The deafening whine of the jet engines suddenly pitched down, settling into a low, quiet idle. Bradley snapped his eyes open, the sudden drop in engine thrust instantly shattering his relief. He lunged forward in his leather seat, screaming at the open cockpit, demanding to know why the aircraft was not moving. He ordered the pilot to accelerate down the runway immediately. The man in the captain's uniform finished his mechanical sequence. He slowly rotated his leather chair to face the cabin. Bradley's breath hitched in his throat. The man wearing the pilot's insignia was not a charter captain. It was the towering, broad-shouldered, heavily scarred leader of my private tactical security division. The operative stared at Bradley with lethal silence. He reached out with a gloved hand, gripped the steel handle of the reinforced cockpit door, and pulled it shut. The military-grade locking mechanism engaged with a loud final click. Bradley was permanently sealed inside an inescapable steel tube, entirely at the mercy of the father he had tried to destroy. The heavy metallic click of the reinforced cockpit door locking echoed through the luxurious cabin like the slam of a bank vault. Bradley stood completely frozen, his hands suspended in the air, his panicked brain struggling to process the catastrophic reality of his situation. He lunged forward, slamming his fists against the impenetrable steel surface of the door. He screamed at the pilot, his voice cracking with raw, unfiltered terror, demanding he open the door and initiate takeoff immediately. The heavy door remained completely immovable. He spun around his chest, heaving violently, his eyes darting frantically toward the flight attendant who stood perfectly still near the galley. He ordered her to engage the manual override. The attendant did not blink. Her professional, accommodating demeanor had entirely vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating posture of a highly trained tactical operative. She reached into her tailored uniform jacket, retrieved a pair of heavy tactical zip ties, and let them dangle silently from her fingers. The opulent interior of the private Gulfstream jet, with its polished mahogany paneling and plush leather seating, instantly transformed from a symbol of ultimate freedom into a claustrophobic, inescapable gilded cage. Bradley backed away, stumbling over the thick bundles of $100 bills he had recklessly thrown onto the carpet just moments before. He looked out the thick oval window of the aircraft. Through the heat distortion radiating from the idling turbines, he saw a rusted, mud-splattered pickup truck parked on the pristine tarmac. The driver's side door opened. My boots hit the pavement with heavy, deliberate precision. I began walking slowly toward the aircraft stairs. The hydraulic hiss of the main cabin door depressurizing sent a violent shudder through Bradley's entire body. The heavy door swung downward, locking into place to form the boarding stairs. The bright morning sun flooded into the dim cabin, illuminating the scattered cash and the absolute terror gripping Bradley's sweating face. I stepped into the doorway, my broad frame filling the entrance. I did not carry a weapon. I did not bring the local police. I brought only the suffocating, inescapable weight of absolute accountability. The final remnants of Bradley's arrogant facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The charismatic tech entrepreneur, the manipulative investor who believed he could outsmart the world entirely, ceased to exist. His knees gave out. He collapsed onto the floor of the cabin, his expensive trousers soaking up the spilled jet fuel he had tracked in from the runway. He fell directly into the pile of stolen currency, his hands grasping at the money as if it could somehow shield him from the consequences of his actions. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of pride. He began sobbing uncontrollably, the sound ripping from his throat in pathetic, ragged gasps. He begged for mercy, his voice a high-pitched, hysterical whine. He promised to leave the country immediately, vowing to disappear into the most remote corner of the globe and never contact Naomi, my company, or anyone in the state ever again. He offered me every single dollar scattered on the floor, claiming he was just a desperate, foolish man who had made a terrible miscalculation under extreme financial pressure. He pleaded for a second chance, swearing that his life was effectively over and that I had already won the war. I stepped over the threshold, my heavy boots crushing the stacks of $100 bills scattered across the entrance. I ignored his hysterical weeping entirely. I walked past his trembling form and took a seat in one of the plush, oversized leather passenger chairs facing the center of the cabin. I leaned back, resting my arms comfortably on the armrests, and looked down at him. My expression contained absolute zero empathy. There was no anger, no vindictiveness, and no satisfaction in my eyes. There was only the cold, mechanical observation of an exterminator verifying the elimination of a pest. Bradley crawled forward on his hands and knees, clutching at the hem of my suit trousers. He continued his pathetic bargaining, desperately offering to sign over full corporate immunity, promising to testify against his own parents, and begging me to let him walk out of the airport a free man. He reasoned that a lengthy, highly publicized federal trial would only bring more unwanted media attention to Naomi, arguing that letting him vanish into exile was the most logical, peaceful solution for everyone involved. He was still trying to manipulate the board, still searching for an angle, still believing he possessed some minuscule fraction of leverage. I leaned forward, the leather seat creaking softly under my weight. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying clarity that instantly silenced his frantic sobbing. I informed him that negotiations require two parties to hold assets of value. I told him he possessed absolutely nothing. I meticulously outlined the devastating reality of his immediate future. I explained that the federal prosecutors had already secured the authenticated audio recordings detailing his remote mountain itinerary and his explicit inquiries regarding accidental death payouts to his offshore accounts. The charge was no longer limited to the embezzlement of his investors' capital, the defrauding of his family's employees, or the theft of Naomi's proprietary software. The charge was premeditated conspiracy to commit murder. I watched his face drain of all remaining color as the sheer magnitude of the word murder resonated in the tight space. I did not raise my voice as I described in agonizing forensic detail exactly how the next 30 years of his life would unfold. I told him there would be no high-profile trial, no dramatic media circus, and no opportunity for his expensive lawyers to negotiate a comfortable plea deal in a minimum security country club. The evidence I had systematically delivered to the federal authorities was so overwhelmingly conclusive, so utterly irrefutable, that his appointed public defender would force him to accept a maximum security sentence just to avoid the lethal injection protocol. I painted a vivid, horrifying picture of the federal penitentiary that awaited him. I described the suffocating windowless concrete cell measuring exactly 6 feet by 8 feet. I detailed the sterile, violent routine of maximum security confinement, the complete stripping of his identity, and the brutal reality of living surrounded by hardened, lifelong predators who would instantly recognize his fundamental weakness. I calculated the math for him. I told him he would be an old, broken, thoroughly forgotten man before he ever touched a blade of grass or breathed free air again. The entire technological industry would evolve and leave him behind. His stolen companies would be liquidated, his parents would be serving their own sentences in adjacent federal facilities, and his name would be entirely erased from the public consciousness. He would spend 3 decades staring at a concrete wall, reliving the exact moment he foolishly decided to put a price tag on my daughter's life. Bradley stared at me, his mouth hanging open in a silent, paralyzed scream. The absolute certainty in my voice completely broke his spirit. The last spark of rebellion, the final illusion of escape, died in his eyes. He slumped forward onto the floor, resting his forehead against the scattered money, a hollow, weeping shell of a human being. I had systematically dismantled his entire existence. I stood up slowly from the leather seat, adjusting my suit jacket. I did not offer a parting word or a final glance. I simply stepped over his broken body and walked out the main cabin door, descending the metal stairs onto the sunlit tarmac. The distant, overlapping wail of approaching sirens rapidly morphed into a deafening roar. Within seconds, a dozen heavily armored black federal SUVs breached the perimeter of the private airfield, their tires screeching as they swarmed the runway. Heavily armed federal marshals wearing tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, forming a tight, impenetrable perimeter entirely surrounding the idling jet. Rifles were raised and commands were shouted over the whine of the turbines. A tactical team immediately stormed up the aircraft stairs, breaching the cabin. I stood quietly by the front bumper of my rusty truck, watching the final act conclude. The federal agents violently hauled Bradley out of the luxurious cabin. He was no longer fighting or bargaining. He was dragged down the metal stairs, his wrists and ankles bound tight in heavy, restrictive steel chains. He shuffled across the tarmac, his head hung in absolute defeat, surrounded by the undeniable reality of his permanent ruin. The deafening roar of the jet turbines faded into the distance as the federal vehicles disappeared down the private access road, taking Bradley and his malicious empire with them. I stood on the empty tarmac, the morning sun warming the hood of my rusty pickup truck. The physical threat was entirely eradicated. Bradley was locked in a federal holding cell, facing decades of maximum security confinement for premeditated attempted murder. The corporate assets were secured. I climbed into the cab of my truck and drove back to the quiet suburban neighborhood that served as my true fortress. I parked in the driveway and walked through the front door. The house was shrouded in a suffocating silence. Naomi was physically safe, but the psychological demolition she had endured over the past 72 hours had finally taken its toll. The adrenaline of the crisis had evaporated, leaving behind a paralyzing emotional exhaustion. She had retreated to her childhood bedroom, locking the heavy wooden door from the inside. She wanted to hide from the world and most of all from herself. She felt entirely inadequate. The brilliant software architect who built a revolutionary artificial intelligence platform from scratch was now questioning her fundamental ability to run her own life. She was consumed by a toxic shame. She blamed herself for failing to see the predator hiding behind a tailored tuxedo. She believed her judgment was permanently flawed, that her heart was a liability, and that she was responsible for bringing a monster into our sanctuary. I did not pound on her bedroom door. I did not demand that she come out or offer empty platitudes. I walked into the kitchen, brewed 2 cups of strong black coffee, and carried them out to the back porch. I sat down in the worn wooden rocking chair, staring out at the manicured lawn. I waited with the infinite patience of a man who had survived his own devastating storms. Hours passed. The bright afternoon sun slowly bled into a cool, muted twilight. The shadows stretched long across the grass. Eventually, the quiet click of the deadbolt echoed down the hallway. The screen door creaked open. Naomi stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in an oversized fleece blanket. Her eyes were swollen red and entirely devoid of their usual fierce spark. She looked fragile, stripped of all her armor. She took the second cup of coffee without a word and sat down on the top step, pulling her knees to her chest. She stared blankly into the darkening yard. She broke the silence with a whisper, confessing that she felt completely stupid. She admitted she no longer trusted her own mind. She asked how she could ever lead a team when she could not protect her own life from a transparent con artist. She declared that she was a failure. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitter liquid grounding me in the present moment. I looked at my daughter and decided it was time to drop the impenetrable stoic facade I had maintained for her entire life. It was time to show her the raw, jagged scars that formed the foundation of our hidden empire. I spoke softly into the evening air. I told her she was not a failure. I explained that she was experiencing the brutal, unforgiving initiation required for true greatness. I took her back 30 years to the darkest period of my existence. I told her about the year her mother Evelyn died. I did not spare her the painful details. I explained that Evelyn's medical treatments had completely bankrupted us. We had 0 assets, 0 leverage, and 0 hope. Following her funeral, I was a hollow, desperate man drowning in insurmountable debt. I was a prime target for opportunistic predators. I confessed that I, too, had been deeply manipulated. A charismatic venture capitalist had approached me during my absolute lowest moment, offering a partnership that promised to eliminate my financial ruin and secure a future for my infant daughter. He smiled, shook my hand, and systematically stripped me of everything I had left. He stole my early patents, forged my signature on disastrous liability contracts, and left me completely exposed to a massive corporate lawsuit. I was ruined. I felt the exact suffocating shame, the identical paralyzing inadequacy that she was experiencing right now. I had failed to protect my family. I had trusted a monster. I watched Naomi's eyes widen in the twilight. She had never known this version of me. She had only known the immovable, wealthy patriarch who controlled everything from the shadows. I leaned forward, my voice hardening with conviction. I told her that failure and betrayal are not permanent states of being. They are brutal, unforgiving teachers. The man who stole my early patents taught me exactly how to identify a corporate predator. The executives who turned a blind eye to my ruin taught me the absolute necessity of building an impenetrable, secretive power base. I explained that I did not simply survive that betrayal. I weaponized it. I used the agonizing humiliation as the primary fuel to construct a holding company so deeply entrenched, so financially devastating, that no one would ever be able to manipulate my family again. I told Naomi that her current pain was not a weakness. It was her armor forging in the fire. Bradley's betrayal had brutally stripped away her naive optimism, but it had also equipped her with the cynical, tactical vision required to successfully navigate the treacherous waters of global enterprise. She had survived a direct lethal assault on her life and her life's work. She was no longer just a brilliant coder. She was a hardened survivor. I promised her she would rise from this shattered engagement with a ferocious clarity that no university or boardroom could ever teach her. The night air settled over the porch. Naomi looked at her cup, her breathing steadying. The rigid tension in her shoulders slowly began to dissolve. The toxic shame was losing its grip, replaced by a cold, quiet realization of her undeniable resilience. She nodded, a faint glimmer of her original analytical fire returning to her eyes. The emotional paralysis was breaking. She was ready to reclaim her territory. Just as the silence between us shifted from heavy grief to calm determination, the sharp crunch of tires on the driveway gravel shattered the peace. A dark, unmarked courier vehicle idled near my mailbox. A man in a simple uniform stepped out, walked up the driveway, and handed a thick, sealed manila envelope directly to Naomi. He required her physical signature. Naomi signed the digital pad, taking the heavy package. She tore open the seal under the porch light. It was a formal, legal summons issued from the county family court. Bradley was attempting one final, desperate legal maneuver from inside his maximum security cell. He was formally claiming marital rights to exactly 50% of Naomi's artificial intelligence software company. The attached legal brief argued that despite the undeniable fact that the marriage certificate signed at the reception was a deliberate forgery, their lengthy cohabitation and shared financial accounts constituted a legally binding union under state common law. The murderer was demanding half of her empire. The heavy sealed envelope from the county family court sat on the kitchen counter like an unexploded bomb. The sharp, definitive click of the deadbolt echoing down the hall hours earlier had signaled Naomi's emergence from the paralysis of shock, but the contents of this summons threatened to pull her right back under. Bradley was cornered in a maximum security federal holding cell, facing 3 decades for premeditated attempted murder, embezzlement, and massive corporate fraud. Yet like a cornered rat, he was frantically biting at any perceived weakness. The sheer audacity of his legal maneuver was breathtaking. He was officially petitioning a civil judge to grant him marital rights to exactly 50% of Naomi's artificial intelligence software company, arguing that their extensive cohabitation and shared financial footprint legally constituted a common law marriage. He was desperately attempting to extract $10 million in a forced corporate settlement to fund his catastrophic legal defense. Naomi stared at the dense legal jargon printed on the thick stationery. The toxic shame that had suffocated her only hours ago began to rapidly curdle into something far more potent. The profound vulnerability she felt on the back porch evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. She looked across the kitchen island at me, her posture straightened. She did not ask if we should settle to avoid a public media circus. She did not express a single ounce of fear or inadequacy. She tapped her index finger sharply against the manila envelope and declared with absolute, unwavering certainty that we were going to utterly annihilate him in open court. The brutal, unforgiving initiation was complete. The brilliant software architect had finally merged with the cynical tactical survivor. She was ready for war. The atmosphere inside the civil courtroom 3 weeks later was incredibly tense. The heavy mahogany paneling and the sterile fluorescent lighting amplified the suffocating pressure of the high-stakes corporate litigation. Bradley sat at the plaintiff's table looking entirely out of place. The expensive tailored suits he previously utilized to project an aura of effortless wealth had been confiscated by federal authorities. He wore a stiff, ill-fitting gray suit provided by his frantic, overworked public defender. Despite his stark physical deterioration, his posture radiated a desperate, cornered viciousness. He was fighting for his actual life, and he was completely willing to drag Naomi down with him. Bradley took the witness stand first. He recognized that his only viable defense was to entirely invert the narrative. Under the aggressive questioning of his desperate attorney, Bradley fabricated a complex, highly coordinated story. He painted himself as an innocent, naive venture capitalist who had been systematically manipulated by a brilliant sociopathic software engineer. He claimed Naomi was the true mastermind behind the entire financial fraud operation. He testified that she had deliberately commingled their corporate accounts to mask her own illegal embezzlement, and that the fraudulent marriage certificate was entirely her idea to secure a larger line of credit from his father's manufacturing conglomerate. He even attempted to spin the remote mountain cabin itinerary, claiming Naomi had organized the trip specifically to push him off a cliff and steal his remaining assets. He lied with the frantic, sweat-drenched conviction of a man staring down the barrel of a lethal injection protocol. He aimed to introduce enough reasonable doubt to force the judge into a mandatory settlement. I sat in the front row of the gallery, maintaining my absolute impenetrable stillness. I watched the judge, an older, stern woman known for her zero-tolerance policy regarding corporate perjury, take meticulous notes. Bradley's public defender finished the direct examination, casting a triumphant look toward our table. He firmly believed the sheer volume of wild accusations would overwhelm our defense. Naomi stood up from the defense table. She did not tremble. She did not display a single ounce of the profound emotional trauma Bradley had inflicted upon her. She walked to the witness stand with the precise, calculated movements of a seasoned corporate executioner. She placed her right hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. When our lead corporate litigator began the direct examination, Naomi did not launch into an emotional defense. She did not cry, plead, or attempt to appeal to the judge's sympathy. She utilized the exact calculating business acumen she had inherently absorbed from watching me build my empire. She transformed the courtroom into a hostile boardroom, and she was the presiding CEO. Naomi methodically dismantled Bradley's fabricated narrative using cold, hard, irrefutable data. She did not argue semantics or rely on character witnesses. She requested permission to utilize the courtroom's digital projector, the screen illuminated with a pristine, highly organized spreadsheet. Naomi presented the judge with the raw, authenticated IP logs extracted directly from Bradley's frozen corporate servers. She pointed to the exact digital timestamps, proving undeniably that Bradley, not her, had manually authorized every single fraudulent transfer from the joint accounts to his hidden offshore cryptocurrency wallets. She presented the encrypted email metadata demonstrating his explicit instructions to the document forger regarding the fake marriage certificate. She then displayed the undeniable financial ledger, proving he had used the stolen funds to immediately pay the initial premium on the $10 million life insurance policy taken out on her life. Bradley's public defender frantically objected, desperately attempting to exclude the digital evidence as inadmissible hearsay. The judge immediately overruled the objection, her eyes locked onto the screen. Naomi continued her surgical demolition. She presented the geolocation data from Bradley's burner phone, placing him exactly at the isolated mountain cabin location 3 weeks before the wedding, proving premeditation for the murder plot. She countered every single lie with a verified time-stamped digital footprint. She did not allow Bradley's lawyer a single inch of maneuvering room. She cornered them with the inescapable reality of binary code. The brilliant software architect was completely destroying the con artist using the exact digital infrastructure he had attempted to manipulate. Bradley gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table, his knuckles turning stark white. The vicious, desperate energy he had brought to the stand evaporated, replaced by absolute crushing panic. He realized his final desperate gambit was failing catastrophically. The judge looked down from the bench, her expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial disgust. She adjusted her glasses, shuffling the stack of irrefutable digital evidence Naomi had provided. She leaned toward the microphone, preparing to issue a definitive ruling that would not only dismiss Bradley's ridiculous claim for corporate equity, but would likely result in immediate severe perjury charges. Before the judge could utter a single word, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, echoing crash. The sudden interruption startled the bailiff and caused the entire gallery to turn around simultaneously. A tall, incredibly stylish woman stepped into the sterile courtroom. She wore a chic, tailored trench coat and oversized designer sunglasses, radiating an air of effortless European sophistication. She paused at the threshold, removing the sunglasses to reveal sharp, piercing eyes. Resting comfortably on her left hip, clutching the fabric of her coat, was a small, blonde-haired toddler. The woman did not look at the judge or the defense table. Her gaze locked directly onto Bradley, who had just turned entirely ashen. This was not a random spectator or a confused witness. This was Bradley's secret fiancée arriving directly from Paris. The stylish woman walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, the sharp click of her heels cutting through the stunned silence. She ignored the whispering gallery and the bewildered defense attorneys. Bradley violently shoved his chair backward. The heavy wooden legs screeched against the polished floor. He lunged across the plaintiff's table, his face contorted into a mask of absolute fury. He pointed a trembling finger at the woman and began screaming vile, desperate obscenities. He ordered her to leave the room, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of corporate composure. He was a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. The judge slammed her heavy wooden gavel repeatedly against the sound block, the sharp cracks echoing like gunfire. She ordered Bradley to sit down and shut his mouth immediately. She leaned over the bench, explicitly threatening him with severe, immediate contempt charges and physical restraints if he uttered another syllable. 2 armed bailiffs instantly moved up directly behind his chair, resting their hands heavily on their utility belts. Bradley collapsed back into his seat, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the room, realizing he was entirely powerless. Naomi's lead litigator approached the bench, formally requesting to call an emergency rebuttal witness to the stand. The judge, her gaze fixed entirely on Bradley's panicked demeanor, granted the motion without hesitation. The stylish woman handed her toddler to a waiting nanny near the back doors and walked gracefully toward the witness box. She placed her right hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. She introduced herself in clear, softly accented English. She was not merely a romantic acquaintance. She was Bradley's long-term fiancée, the mother of his child, and the primary reason he desperately needed $10 million in untraceable offshore capital. Bradley's public defender attempted to object, stammering about irrelevant character assassination, but the judge sharply overruled him, demanding the witness continue. The fiancée did not simply offer emotional testimony. She reached into her tailored trench coat and pulled out a thick stack of handwritten letters bound by a silk ribbon. She handed the bundle directly to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. The woman testified that Bradley had written these letters to her over the past 12 months. She read excerpts aloud into the microphone. The words were a meticulously documented blueprint of his entire criminal enterprise. Bradley explicitly detailed his calculated plan to systematically drain Naomi's family trust. He described in his own distinct handwriting exactly how he intended to frame Naomi for the massive corporate embezzlement, leaving her holding the bag for the ruined software company while he vanished. The final letter, dated just weeks before the ruined wedding, outlined the most horrifying phase of his exit strategy. He promised his Parisian fiancée that a massive $10 million life insurance payout was imminent. He assured her that immediately following the insurance settlement, he would fake his own tragic death in a boating accident, severing all ties to his American identity, and permanently relocate to France to live a life of absolute luxury with her and their son. The courtroom descended into an icy, suffocating silence. The physical letters were the ultimate, undeniable proof of extreme premeditation. Bradley's defense attorney dropped his pen, burying his face in his hands, realizing his client had just handed the prosecution the murder weapon. Bradley sat entirely paralyzed, his eyes locked onto the bundle of letters resting on the judge's bench. He could not comprehend how his perfectly isolated Parisian sanctuary had violently collided with his American courtroom defense. He severely underestimated the reach and resources of a father determined to protect his daughter. I remained perfectly still in the front row of the gallery, watching the flawless execution of my final tactical strike. I had located the fiancé exactly 2 weeks ago, utilizing the fragmented international routing numbers Gavin had extracted from the offshore insurance syndicate. I deployed a specialized team of private investigators to Paris, confirming her identity, the existence of the child, and her complete ignorance regarding Bradley's violent American schemes. She genuinely believed he was a successful venture capitalist finalizing a complex corporate merger. When my operatives presented her with the irrefutable evidence of his impending marriage to Naomi and the horrifying truth regarding the life insurance plot, she was devastated. I did not rely on her moral outrage alone. I offered her absolute financial security. I secretly wired a massive, untraceable sum of money directly into an encrypted account under her name. It was enough capital to guarantee her and her son a safe, luxurious life permanently independent of Bradley. The only condition was her physical presence in this courtroom and the surrender of the handwritten correspondence. I bought her absolute loyalty, transforming her from Bradley's escape plan into his ultimate executioner. The judge finished reading the final letter. She slowly lowered the pages, her face hardening into a mask of pure judicial wrath. She looked directly at Bradley. She did not bother to issue a ruling on his absurd civil claim for marital equity. She addressed the entire courtroom, her voice echoing with absolute, unyielding authority. She stated that the sheer volume of premeditated malice, extreme financial fraud, and documented intent to commit murder presented before her court was unprecedented. She officially dismissed Bradley's civil suit with extreme prejudice. Because the federal prosecutors had synchronized their efforts with our civil litigation, the judge formally handed down the binding sentence for the consolidated criminal charges. She did not offer a single ounce of leniency. She systematically listed his crimes, condemning his absolute lack of remorse and his sociopathic willingness to destroy innocent lives for personal gain. She brought the gavel down with a final echoing strike, delivering a devastating sentence. Bradley was condemned to exactly 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole or sentence reduction. The absolute finality of the judgment hung heavy in the stale courtroom air. The reality of 3 decades in a concrete box finally broke through Bradley's thick delusion. He erupted from his chair, a raw, primal scream tearing from his throat. The sound was a horrifying mixture of pure terror and utter despair. The two armed bailiffs instantly descended upon him. They grabbed his arms violently, twisting them behind his back, and secured his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs. Bradley kicked and thrashed his expensive shoes, slipping on the polished floor. He screamed Naomi's name, begging her to stop them, pleading for a mercy he never intended to show her. He screamed at his fiancée, calling her a traitor, his voice cracking as the bailiffs dragged him backward down the center aisle. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, revealing the dark waiting corridor of the holding cells. The bailiffs pulled him through the threshold. The doors slammed shut instantly, cutting off his frantic, echoing screams, sealing him away from the world forever. Naomi stood at the defense table, watching the closed wooden doors. She did not flinch. She did not shed a single tear. The brilliant software architect who had almost lost everything had successfully orchestrated the total annihilation of her predator. The brutal initiation was over. She turned around, looking past her team of litigators, and locked eyes with me. She was no longer a victim. She was the undisputed heir to an empire ready to build her own legacy. The legal battles were completely finished. The exhausting media circus surrounding Bradley's spectacular public downfall evaporated, leaving our suburban estate in absolute silence. The physical threat was eradicated, but the psychological demolition had taken a devastating toll. Naomi was physically safe but emotionally shattered. The brilliant software architect who built a revolutionary artificial intelligence platform from scratch was now questioning her fundamental ability to run her own life. She was consumed by a toxic, suffocating shame. She blamed herself for failing to see the predator hiding behind a tailored tuxedo. She believed her judgment was permanently flawed, that her heart was a liability, and that she was directly responsible for bringing a remorseless monster into our sanctuary. The reality of her vulnerability crushed her spirit. She retreated entirely, locking herself inside her childhood bedroom. She refused to answer her phone, ignored mounting corporate emails, and effectively vanished. She desperately wanted to hide from the world, terrified of making another catastrophic miscalculation. I understood that if I allowed her to shelter beneath my immense wealth, she would forever remain an engineer hiding from her potential. She would use my resources as an emotional crutch. I absolutely refused to let my success stunt her inherent greatness. I needed her to be fierce, independent, and entirely self-sufficient. I walked down the hallway and knocked firmly on her wooden door. I did not demand that she return to the boardroom. I simply asked her to step outside. She unlocked the door, stepping out in a faded sweater, her eyes red, swollen, and devoid of their usual fierce spark. We walked out the back door and sat together on the weathered wooden porch of my modest original home. We sat in silence, watching the fading afternoon light stretch across the manicured lawn. I handed her a steaming cup of black coffee. I decided it was time to permanently drop the impenetrable stoic facade I had meticulously maintained for her entire life. It was time to show her the raw, jagged scars that formed the foundation of our hidden empire. I spoke softly into the cooling evening air. I explicitly told her she was not a failure. I explained that she was currently experiencing the brutal, unforgiving emotional initiation required for true greatness. I took her back 30 years, transporting her to the darkest, most terrifying period of my existence. I finally shared the incredibly painful story of exactly how I built my sprawling empire from absolute nothingness immediately after her beautiful mother, Evelyn, tragically died. I did not spare her the humiliating details. I explained that Evelyn's extensive medical treatments had completely bankrupted us. Following her somber funeral, I was a hollow, frightened man drowning in insurmountable financial debt, holding a newborn daughter with zero liquid assets and zero hope. I quietly confessed that I too had been deeply, ruthlessly manipulated. A charismatic venture capitalist had deliberately approached me during my absolute lowest, most vulnerable moment, offering a lucrative partnership that promised immediate financial salvation. He smiled warmly, shook my hand, and systematically stripped me of everything I had left. He viciously stole my early engineering patents, forged my signature on disastrous corporate liability contracts, and left me completely exposed to a massive, ruinous lawsuit. I was entirely ruined. I felt the exact same suffocating shame and paralyzing emotional inadequacy that she was experiencing right now. I watched Naomi's wet eyes widen in sheer disbelief. She had never known this profoundly vulnerable version of me. She had only known the immovable, fiercely wealthy patriarch who aggressively controlled everything from the unseen shadows. I leaned forward, my voice suddenly hardening with absolute conviction. I told her that devastating failure and cruel betrayal are not permanent states of being. They are brutal, necessary teachers. The arrogant man who stole my early patents inadvertently taught me exactly how to identify a lethal corporate predator. I forcefully used the agonizing humiliation as the primary explosive fuel to construct a holding company so deeply entrenched that absolutely no one would ever manipulate or threaten my family again. I stood up from the wooden porch and instructed her to follow me. We left the modest house and drove directly to the subterranean data center. The chilled room was bathed in the harsh white glare of the primary monitors. The relentless mechanical hum of the towering server racks provided a steady heartbeat to the underground bunker. I brought her to the central reinforced glass desk. I told her that my protective empire was officially closed to her. She would no longer have any access to my elite legal division, my tactical security team, or my unlimited offshore capital reserves. I placed a single manila folder onto the cold glass surface. I handed her the cryptographic keys to a newly formed, completely isolated holding company. I explained that it was completely separate from my sprawling empire containing only a strict, unalterable limit of initial seed capital. She had to build it from the ground up, directly facing her own terrifying risks and massive rewards, just as I did decades ago. If she made a fatal miscalculation, she would face genuine, irreversible financial ruin. I would absolutely not intervene. She had to risk her own limited capital, hire her own dedicated operatives, and aggressively navigate the treacherous corporate landscape entirely exposed. She had to learn how to bleed, how to quickly recover, and how to conquer the market on her own terms. The new holding company was her blank canvas. The proprietary artificial intelligence software she had fiercely defended with her life was her primary weapon. Naomi looked down at the physical folder. The heavy emotional paralysis was rapidly breaking. She did not hesitate or ask for a comfortable safety net. She accepted the keys with a determined, sharp smile. The fierce, calculating spark had fully returned to her eyes. She rapidly opened her laptop and immediately utilized her proprietary software designs to scan the global financial market. She completely bypassed standard corporate pleasantries and boldly initiated her first major offensive. She targeted a massive commercial contract, instantly identifying the primary competitor bidding for the lucrative deal. It was the exact elite rival tech firm that Bradley had foolishly idolized. Naomi did not just want to win the contract, she wanted to publicly execute her arrogant rivals. She outbid the tech syndicate by a calculated margin, instantly securing the commercial acquisition and shattering their market position. The digital confirmation flashed across her glowing screen. She successfully risked her limited capital and utterly dominated a global syndicate in her first independent maneuver. She closed her laptop, her posture radiating absolute corporate authority. She was no longer a victim. She was a ferocious titan. Just as she stood up to leave the data center, the fax machine whirred loudly to life. A thick document printed out onto the plastic tray. Naomi walked over and picked up the heavy paper. It was a formal legal summons. Bradley was attempting one final legal maneuver from his prison cell. He formally claimed rights to 50% of her company. His lawyers argued that despite the forgery, their cohabitation and shared accounts constituted a binding union under state common law. The tires of my heavily weathered pickup truck crunched softly against the familiar gravel of my driveway. The late afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of my quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a picturesque scene of middle-class tranquility, entirely detached from the brutal, high-stakes corporate warfare I had just concluded in the city. The staggering contrast between the two worlds was profound. Just hours ago, I had orchestrated the absolute financial and legal annihilation of a ruthless predator. I had secured a 30-year maximum security federal prison sentence for the man who tried to murder my daughter. I had watched Naomi transform from a shattered, vulnerable victim into a ferocious corporate titan independently outmaneuvering a global tech syndicate and claiming her rightful place in the industry. Now I was simply a senior citizen returning to his modest, unremarkable house in a rusted vehicle. I killed the rumbling engine and stepped out into the humid air. The heavy metal door of the truck shut with a loud, hollow, metallic clang that echoed down the silent street. The noise immediately drew the attention of my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. She was a perpetual busybody, a woman whose entire existence revolved around neighborhood association guidelines and aggressively policing property values. She stood on the edge of her pristine, meticulously landscaped lawn, clutching a bright green watering can. Her eyes narrowed as they swept over the dented quarter panels and the peeling paint of my vehicle. She marched to the edge of the property line, her posture rigid with self-righteous indignation. She loudly informed me that my truck was a dreadful eyesore. She suggested with thinly veiled condescension that it was actively dragging down the aesthetic standards of the entire street. She advised me to finally scrap the useless pile of junk and purchase something respectable, offering the unsolicited opinion that a man my age should take considerably more pride in his outward appearances. I stopped at the edge of my walkway and looked at her. A decade ago, a younger, less disciplined version of myself might have felt the sudden burning urge to aggressively correct her arrogance. I might have been tempted to casually mention that I could purchase her house, the entire subdivision, and the bank that held her mortgage with a single, unverified wire transfer from my smallest offshore account. I could have easily shattered her narrow worldview by revealing the colossal, terrifying magnitude of the empire I controlled from the shadows. But standing there in the fading sunlight, I felt absolutely no desire to prove my worth to a stranger. True uncorrupted power does not require an audience. It does not need to boast flex or demand validation from insignificant spectators. The desperate need to project wealth and status was exactly the fatal flaw that had ultimately destroyed Bradley. He was entirely consumed by the illusion of power, driven by a pathetic hunger for external validation. I operated on a fundamentally different frequency. My wealth was a tactical weapon, a silent shield constructed solely to protect my bloodline, not a decorative badge to impress suburban busybodies. I looked at Mrs. Higgins and smiled. It was a warm, entirely genuine smile rooted in the profound peace of a man who had absolutely nothing left to prove. I politely tipped my weathered canvas hat, wished her a wonderful evening, and turned my back on her bewildered expression. I walked up the concrete steps, unlocked my front door, and stepped into the cool, dark sanctuary of my home. The heavy wooden door clicked shut instantly, severing the ambient noise of the outside world. The house was perfectly silent. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of grief or isolation that had plagued this space in the days immediately following Evelyn's death. This was a completely different atmosphere. It was the absolute, uncorrupted peace of a man who had successfully executed his primary biological and moral directive. I had protected my family. I had identified a lethal camouflage threat, isolated the enemy, and annihilated him with absolute surgical precision. The chessboard was entirely clear. The hostile pieces were permanently removed from the table. I walked into the small, practical kitchen. The linoleum floors and the dated laminate countertops were a stark reminder of the humble beginnings I had intentionally preserved. I did not require marble surfaces or imported stainless steel appliances. This kitchen was exactly as Evelyn had designed it, and keeping it intact served as a daily grounding mechanism, anchoring me to the raw reality of where we started. I filled the glass carafe with cold water and poured it into the reservoir of my old, reliable coffee maker. I measured out 3 heavy scoops of dark, bitter grounds. The machine hissed and sputtered, filling the room with the rich, earthy aroma that had fueled my most grueling nights building the holding company from absolute nothingness. I poured the steaming black liquid into a thick ceramic mug and carried it into the living room. I walked past the modest television and the simple wooden bookshelves, moving directly toward the corner of the room. I sat down heavily in my worn leather armchair. The material creaked softly, perfectly molded to the shape of my body over years of silent contemplation. I leaned my head back against the cushion, allowing the physical exhaustion of the past month to finally wash over my bones. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the high-stakes corporate maneuvers, the dangerous hostage retrieval, and the fierce courtroom battles slowly drained from my system. My muscles relaxed. My breathing slowed into a deep, steady rhythm. Resting on the stone mantelpiece directly across from my chair was a silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of my late wife, Evelyn. She was smiling radiantly, holding a newborn Naomi wrapped in a hospital blanket. I stared at the photograph, the flickering shadows of the room playing across the glass. When Evelyn passed away, I made a silent, unbreakable vow over her grave. I promised her that I would endure the crushing weight of our financial ruin. I swore that I would absorb the humiliating betrayals, navigate the treacherous corporate predators, and build an impenetrable fortress around our daughter. I promised that Naomi would never experience the terror of absolute vulnerability. Looking at the photograph now, I knew my mission was fully accomplished. I had not simply shielded Naomi from the harsh realities of the world. I had provided her with the brutal, necessary education required to conquer it. She had faced pure, unadulterated evil and emerged victorious. She had taken the cryptographic keys to a volatile holding company and instantly transformed into an aggressive dominant force in the technology sector. She did not need my protection anymore. She was entirely self-sufficient, armed with a ferocious intellect and a hardened tactical vision. The empire was secure, but more importantly, the heir to the empire was forged in steel. I raised the ceramic mug in a silent toast to the woman in the photograph. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter black coffee. The silence of the house wrapped around me like a heavy, comforting blanket. There were no more hidden enemies lurking in the shadows. There were no more desperate battles to fight. There was only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a father who had kept his promise. True power never requires a public audience or loud validation. When you build your life on a foundation of genuine substance, the desperate need to prove your worth to strangers completely vanishes. Betrayal and failure are brutal teachers, but they are absolutely necessary to forge unbreakable resilience. We often mistake kindness for weakness, but true strength lies in the silent, calculated ability to protect those we love without seeking recognition. Dignity is not purchased with luxury or status. It is earned through unwavering principles and quiet execution. The loudest voices generally hide deep insecurities, while true silence holds absolute power. Share this story of silent power and resilience with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below detailing your favorite moment from Howard and Naomi's remarkable journey.